Welcome to the Fantasy Fangirls Podcast, where two sisters dive deep into beloved fantasy lore, characters, themes, theories, and more. Thank you for joining us for today's bonus episode, where we share our reactions and a review of House of Flame and Shadow, the third Crescent City book by Sarah J. Maas that has taken the book community by storm. But before we get any further, please listen closely to our content warning. Today's Fantasy Fangirls spoiler warning is a little different than usual as we cover a different book with a unique series crossover, so again, please listen closely. First and foremost, we highly recommend you have finished Crescent City 2, House of Sky and Breath before listening to our CC3 spoiler-free and especially our spoilery sections. The first part of this podcast episode is going to be plot spoiler-free. Did you hear me? The first part of this episode will be plot spoiler-free for House of Flame and Shadow. We're still going to be covering some general sentiments and observations, but nothing that gives away anything on the story itself. However, we will be talking about the end of CC2 and how that factors into this book. So please do not enter even the spoiler-free part of this conversation if you have not finished Crescent City 2. If you have finished Crescent City 2, though, we're also going to assume that you are rather familiar, if not having totally been familiar, with the Court of Thorns and Roses series. After we share our spoiler-free review of House of Flame and Shadow, we will give a big spoiler warning before jumping into all of CC3, where it is absolutely spoiler central for Flame and Shadow, as well as the two previous books of the Crescent City series, and A Court of Thorns and Roses, specifically A Court of Silver Flames, which is the last book in the ACOTAR series. Next up, Fantasy Fangirls, we are rated R. We are adults who say adult things with adult words about an adult book. While alpha hole might not be a cuss word per se, we will be using it, and using it a large amount. So please be mindful of little listening ears. Last thing before we jump into our Crescent City 3 spoiler-free reactions part. If you are like, I can't get enough of Fantasy Fangirls, I can't wait to jump into the ACOTAR and Maasverse world with them. If you want more content, more community connection, discounts on merch, early access to ad-free episodes, and more events, all while supporting us in making Fantasy Fangirls our livelihood, please check out our Patreon. We have 2 membership tiers on there, friendly to any financial budget. And our Patreon community, it is so incredible and active. It's amazing. The link to join our Patreon is in the show notes or YouTube captions or patreon.com/fantasyfangirls. And really and truly, thank you so much for helping us bring these episodes to you. And now it is time to enter the House of Flame and Shadow. So we are entering our spoiler-free discussion of House of Flame and Shadow. If you have not read or finished this book, but you have finished the previous 2 Crescent City books, please join us on this conversation, and we will let you know when it is time to skitter on out of here. Okay, so this is actually going to be interesting because Nicole and I had different experiences in the lead up to this book, which ended up impacting each of our initial feelings about it. For instance, I finished House of Sky and Breath about 2 weeks before Flame and Shadow came out, but I'm also only halfway through the Throne of Glass series. So I had to be very careful how I approached theories, and I focused more on reading other books than going down Crescent City theory rabbit holes. As excited as I was for this book to come out, I wasn't really part of the big hype leading up to it with all the predictions and the guides and such. I have some serious FOMO with it, but it's okay. I was there for Iron Flame. It felt like I was mostly playing catch up while I was still reading Tog, and of course we were finishing up our Iron Flame deep dive episodes. And I was really trying to avoid Tog spoilers as much as I could, which is really hard to do when you're getting excited about all of the possibilities in a Maasverse crossover book and all the theories that go from it. So all of this to say, I went into House of Flame and Shadow excited about the crossover, but without any expectations like so much of the fandom understandably had for the last 2 years. Meanwhile, I finished CC2 around a month before the release of CC3, so I did not have long to wait, but man, let me tell you, it was a long month. And if you know the end of CC2, like we said, we will be talking about it. It ends on the huge cliffhanger. And that chapter, in my opinion, is one of the most beautifully written, gut-wrenching, just perfect chapters in all of literature that I have ever experienced, and I will die on that hill. And seconds after finishing chapter 78 of CC2, I dove into Theoryland. Now, keep in mind, I have read the entire Maasverse, so I went balls deep. I had nothing to hold back. I was reading and listening to anything I could in regards to what could possibly happen in House of Flame and Shadow. And to be honest, without knowing it, my expectations of what level of world building, crossover, twists, turns really went sky high. And I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but I'm going to just leave it at that for right now. I'm not going to lie, as a new-ish Maasverse girly, it is very intimidating to be in the positions where Lexi and I are in. There are names being thrown around in these like deep dive, long form theories that I'm like, who was that? I don't remember who that was. I had this like level of anxiety coming into this book because I knew it was SJM. Every single description, every single, like she could describe a cave wall and it would have like 20 different meanings in 3 different worlds that we all know and love. And I wanted to eat it all up. So not only did I have really high expectations on the book itself, but I also put a lot of pressure on myself to expect myself to catch all these little SJM nuances. And shockingly, me being a slight perfectionist in this moment, I did not live up to my own expectations. Oh well, I am human. But that's really all I can say about my expectations going into the book. And also, I'm just going to go ahead and address this right up top. I apologize. I sound like ass on a stick. I am a little sick. I am coming out of a head cold. Just going to have to bear with it a little, friends. It's got this musky voice timbre to it. So I apologize for any of that today.
Poor Nicole.
It's been a rough week.
We've all had those weeks.
Terrible. So with our different levels of expectations in mind, let's kick it off with, again, our spoiler-free discussion of addressing this question. Lexi, did you like this book?
Overall, yes, I did like it. I'll give it 4 out of 5 stars. House of Flame and Shadow was on par with my feelings towards the other Crescent City books. There were lore info dumps that I'm lucky if I understood half of them, which I love those so much, by the way. Interesting characters, but they also make very infuriating decisions. Then there were, of course, these signature complex plots with contributing side POVs. It was all very much Crescent City, and I loved that. My favorite part about the Crescent City books, and specifically House of Flame and Shadow, is how beautifully the world building connects a greater universe that we all know and love. And just on that same note, for context here about like our approach and all of our feelings about this book and the series in general, let me give my quick general thoughts about each of the SJM series. So even though I'm only on Heir of Fire and the Throne of Glass series, I'm leaning towards it being my favorite. The FMC is absolutely amazing. I love the pacing, the plots, the character development, and the world building. I love all of it. And then, of course, ACOTAR, it has such a special place in my heart because it's the series that got me back into fantasy reading. The characters, the places, and the magic are collectively my favorite out of all of her series. And then we have Crescent City, which of course I appreciate for its interconnected web of universe world building, like I was saying. But it is probably my least favorite out of the SJM books, even though House of Sky and Breath's final chapter was my all-time favorite ending of any book. Nicole was saying it as well. Like, we love that ending so much. However, I was not a big fan of CC2 until that last chapter. I will also admit I was in a very tough state of mind while I was reading CC2 with a lot of personal stuff going on, and I think that really impacted the vibes that I felt from the book. The best parts of that book were day and night and then the ending. That's how I feel about CC2 in a nutshell. But I really did love House of Earth and Blood once I got through the intense world building of the first several chapters. The mystery, Bryce's hero's journey, the tension between her and Hunt, I loved it despite not being the biggest fan of urban fantasy. So with all of this, I think I need to put CC3 in second to CC1, but I had very different feelings about each of the books. CC1 was more consistently good, and I loved our characters in that book, but CC3 had more really great moments. Although it did have really frustrating sections, not moments, but sections that brought down my overall feelings about it. So in conclusion, it didn't completely knock my socks off. Again, there were those moments that I loved, but then other moments that I had to literally stop listening or reading and call you, Nicole, and just yell about what was happening before I got so mad. Like, Nicole was out of town, like, for a family event, and I'm like calling her when she's like in an Uber with like all of her in-laws and being like, I don't care where you are right now, we need to talk about Bryce. So
true.
And it was not in a good character development, I understand why this is happening, even if I don't like it way. It was in a, oh my God, I don't like these characters that I'm supposed to like kind of way.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm going to say before I get into spoiler territory. But yes, solid 4 stars because it was a roller coaster of a book with really great highs and really low lows.
I'm going to actually categorize my review almost in 2 different sections because I had 2 very different experiences reading this book. My first time reading through it, I hit a point at the end of part 1 where, quite frankly, I was so emotionally charged, and that's a kind way of putting pissed off, by what was happening that I needed to take a break from the book. And I'm not someone who takes breaks from books. And then I slogged my way through part 2, mainly because I was feeling some kind of feelings. And also I was out of town, like Lexi had mentioned. It was really hard for me to make it through and like sit down and actually immerse myself in the story. So I was genuinely, worried. I'll say worried, maybe rather than afraid. I was genuinely worried that this was going to be the first SJM book that I didn't like. And that is a feeling I never expected to happen. However, when I was heading out of town, I get a text from Lexi with some very accidental, we will never blame her for this, major spoilers that happen in part 3. And I will explain the full story later in the spoiler heavy section because I want to obviously be mindful here as spoiler freeze. And I was so relieved to hear the spoiler because I didn't think it was going to happen, and it made me actually excited to keep reading. So honestly, I was grateful. This is the only time I've ever been grateful to hear a spoiler. So thank you, Lexi.
I felt so bad.
We'll tell the full story in the spoiler section for sure. And it's okay. No one blames you. If anything, I was grateful. So then when I got to part 3, I was definitely more on the edge of my seat. It was more of that SJM typical ending. Choices at the end seemed a lot more in alignment with the characters I know and love, and I was actually able to get back into the story. So that was all my first read. It was really high because I loved part 1, then a major low, then about medium tier. Then I did my reread with some majorly adjusted expectations, and I did enjoy the book much more. And I got to luxuriate in the Easter eggs that SJM is an absolute genius, and it's what makes SJM who she is. And I found myself understanding most character choices. I'm going to say most. Even enjoying some POVs that I really thought were kind of more filler in this book. So with all of this in mind, I am also going to give this a 4 out of 5 for the book plot, the characters, the storylines, etc. For it being a Crescent City book, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. However, I do think that there were a lot of expectations that happened naturally over a 2+ year waiting gap, and especially given the ending of CC2. There were a lot of expectations going into this book. And given the level of theorizing, worlds crossing, speculated character involvement, etc., that quite frankly, this book did not live up to that hype. But I'm not going to knock the book down itself because it did not live up to some of our level of theorizing. And I'm going to talk about that more in a second. The only reason I did not give this book a 5 out of 5 is because there were some character choices that felt out of alignment with who we know them to be. Like Lexi was saying, it's like normally we're really good at putting ourselves in these character shoes and saying, okay, what would actually cause them to do this and da-da-da. And I couldn't see their choices. I couldn't understand why they were making them. Now, does this mean I did not enjoy the book? Of course not. I love the world of Crescent City. I love the urban fantasy. I love the modern language of the tech. I loved learning about more magic and like some of the more of the houses and seeing our characters grow and develop, plus getting some new characters and letting them shine on page. It was spectacular. I love it. I can't wait to talk about it. But the SJM world parallels are a huge part of this book, and it was a little bit more subtext than I expected. So for me, the pacing of part 1 was epic, part 2 was traditional for a CC book, and part 3 was SJM in her element. In conclusion, was this my favorite book? Was this my favorite Crescent City book? No, CC1 was a masterpiece in my opinion, and I actually really liked CC2 and everything that was happening for different reasons, but that's all I'm going to give right now while we're in the spoiler free.
Well, and let's continue this spoiler-free section with some reactions to a few general themes. Again, no plot spoilers here, but we are touching on a little bit of lore and character sentiment that contributes to these general themes. So let's quickly address the frequent POVs, because I actually didn't mind all of the POVs that many readers have called whiplash. I've also been reading a lot of TOG and CC recently, so this was very similar to the writing style I've been immersed in recently. Was it sometimes a little jumpy where it was hard for me to get immersed immersed in a scene. Yeah, but it didn't notably impact my reading experience. I like that CC stays focused on specific characters, and even though some are way more interesting than others, they're all more or less tied into the overarching plot. And I like that. I'm looking at you, George R.R. Martin, because I love you, but you go a little too far with your character world building, and that is saying something coming from me. So,
Really is.
SJM, you did better than George R.R. Martin in this regard.
Wow.
Although I do wish that they were just per chapters. I do wish that, but I didn't mind the way that it was set up. Yeah.
Interesting. In part 2 and 3, I didn't mind the frequent switching and stuff like that. However, there is about a 15 chapter stretch, and I'm not joking, a 15 chapter stretch in part 1 that I would have understood a lot more. I would have gotten a lot more immersed in, and I would have known what the fuck was happening, to just be quite honest, if it was less of that whiplash, in my opinion, especially since it is such a roller coaster, heart pumping moment. We do get POVs from about 6 different characters, and while I do have my favorites, and then some that I was not as emotionally invested in. Like you're saying, Lex, all POVs felt natural to this story. I think we both agree on that. Yeah. I loved getting some of the additional new POVs that, I'll just squeal about in the spoiler section. So I did love that. Now, do I wish that we didn't spend as much time with some of them? God damn it. Yes, I do. But again, I understand in hindsight why it makes sense in the full scope of the story.
Yes, definitely. And then, of course, we have the multiverse lore. Friends, seriously, only listen further if you've read House of Sky and Breath, because the multiverse lore was my favorite part about this book. I love the complexities that the CC series introduces in layers and how it all connects to other universes, especially some of which we're familiar with from the other SJM books. The intricate lore webs are I think that they're absolutely masterful, and I love how it plays out on page in the Crescent City books, especially this newest one.
Interesting. For me, the level of lore dumping, it's just something you expect in a Crescent City novel. You expect to know what's going on for 70% of the time of a book. And
that's very generous. That's very. Once I texted you, I was like, I don't know what I'm reading, but I love it about the first book.
That checks out. And there's a reason, honestly, it's become such a huge inside joke on Book Talk that you just don't know what's going on half the time in a Crescent City book. And I do think that was expected, going into this book. But this book did take lore dumps to a whole new level. There was a few times in the book where it's just okay, sit down, lecture about what's going on. And after about dump number 4, no matter how many times I went back and listened to it, I always felt like I was about 10 steps behind. And to be kind of honest, I expect to feel like I'm playing catch up, especially the first time reading through any fantasy book. But this was a little too far in the direction where I found myself actually getting frustrated with the lore because I didn't understand it. There's a difference between feeling with Iron Flame, the first time reading through it, I was like, okay, I think I know what's going on with everything at the very end with, stuff that happens with that. I won't say just for spoilers in case this is your first time joining us, but there's stuff that I'm like, oh, okay, I don't understand what's going on, but I know the general sentiment. This was where I was like, I couldn't tell you 3 things about what's happening in this moment. And it was a little frustrating. I will say there is one major lore dump that is absolutely masterful from Sarah J. Maas. And I'm going to shout to Sealy Queen on our Discord for typing it all out in a bulleted list and putting it in the Discord channel for CC3. That lore drop was one of my favorite parts of the book because of so many things we get confirmed as readers. And it was just beautiful. And in true SJM fashion, it of course opens up about 50,000 more questions. But that's what we love about this type of lore. And yes, we will be going into point by point that entire lore dump in just a moment.
But before we do officially move into our spoiler central part of this episode, I want to set expectations here for our listeners and let you know that while we would love to parse through all of the lore and do our usual deep dives and what this means for the Maasverse with theories and all of that, this episode is going to primarily be focused on our reactions to what happens in CC3, just because we have to keep this jam-packed episode somewhat on track and within a reasonable amount of time. We are going to do a Maasverse bonus episode in March, and we will absolutely bring all of this new knowledge and speculation into that conversation. So stay tuned for more on all of the lore and what this means for future theories and speculation for new books. that wraps up our spoiler-free part of this reactions episode to House of Flame and Shadow. So this is our polite but very firm request to please leave this conversation. Yeah, we love you, but leave.
We appreciate you listening. We really do. But it is time to part ways. Please come back, flag this episode, and listen to this only when you have read and or listened to House of Flame and Shadow. This is your last chance to stop this episode and switch to something else, maybe House of Flame and Shadow audiobook, before we start talking about spoilers. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, because there's about 45 million things that we need to talk about right now, and we'll get to all of it, but this is going to be a lot. So let's start with, first and foremost, our high-level thoughts. High level actually might be totally lying through my teeth. Our thoughts on each of the main characters in Crescent City 3. And by the way, really quickly, yes, we are talking about Crescent City 3 here. We will also be talking about the ACOTAR universe. So we highly recommend not listening further if you have not read ACOTAR. We will also be talking about high-level stuff in TOG, no major spoilers, with the exception of one section that we will give a blatant spoiler warning for.
For instance, again, I have not finished TOG, and I know the general sense of this, and I don't feel like it is jeopardizing my reading experience. But again, that's how I feel about the spoilers. So if you do not want anything, maybe this isn't the episode for you.
Come back after you've read 16 Maasverse books, and we will be here. But let's get back to our main characters in CC3. And we are starting with the perfect protagonist, because I'm convinced that this guy is the protagonist of this book, and that is Rune Dannon, Crown Prince of the Valbaran Fae, my dude. Rune was my favorite character in this book. He was one of my favorite characters in this book. From the torture chamber POVs where we get him and Lydia's tension, to him stepping into stepdad energy. I love it. Him and Lydia's love story, everything. It was just so well done. Now, I love Rune. I do wish, if I had one little criticism, it would just be this. And I wish we got more time with him and Lydia's love story, with the tension, specifically more in part 2. We do get a bit, especially with him and Lydia going through the archives in Avalon, all that kind of stuff. We get a lot of time with them, but it wasn't that tension that we're used to in an SJM story. And one of the character choices that I didn't love was Rune shooting Lydia. We'll talk about that more when we get into the part 3 section. I didn't love that character choice. It felt very out of touch with who Rune is as a person. But with all of that being said, it was so fun to see Rune grow up from the fuck-it-all party frat boy to that big old stepdad energy that he really brought to the party in CC3. I died when he asked Lydia if her sons were her siblings after he's chasing her upstairs in the depth charger. And it's just oh my guy, you're so sweet. You're so cute. And I will say their spice was also my favorite in the story. Now, there wasn't a whole bar to reach really high for this story. There wasn't a whole lot of spice in general, but the spice that was there between Rune and Lydia was phenomenal. Don't get me started on Bryce and Hunt, because I will be here for 45 minutes and yelling into a microphone.
Well, just as we're talking about spice, even Rune and Lydia, I didn't get a whole lot of spice from this book, which I'm kind of okay with, but it almost felt weirdly placed when they were in the caves. And it's guys, this is not the best time here. And they even acknowledge it.
Yeah. For me, it was the, when they're in the hay barn and Lydia's speaking, they're speaking mind to mind. And then, I think it's either Deck or Flynn. I think it was Flynn. Who was please don't fuck in front of us.
That part, that was one of the really great moments, but it's also I guess that was spite. It was a teaser. Yeah.
It was again, a teaser.
The sexual tension between them, I did like. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But Rune, he has just been a shining star in the Crescent City series. Yeah. He's starborn, right? Haha. And he absolutely did not disappoint in this third book. He deserves all of the happiness in the world after what he's been through, especially starting out with his dad and just he's very lost in his ways when we meet him in Crescent City 1, and he's just grown so much, and I just love it so much. And his bonus chapter is the perfect epilogue for him, and it made me fall in love with Rune all over again. Yes, we will be discussing the bonus chapters towards the end of this episode, but I loved it. I loved Rune. I think he really carried this book, and yes, he made some decisions that were this is maybe not my favorite, but you know what? That's what I like about a character, is that they make decisions that you might not agree with, but you can still understand why they would have made that choice. So.
Well, speaking of things that carried this book, let's talk about Lydia Servos, because she is perfect.
fucking fiction. SJM introduced her into this world as this like horrific villain. You know, we only started to see the good side of her when it was not even quote unquote her, it was Daybright. And it was in the last few chapters of CC2 when we started to meld these two people together. But to have her steamroll her way through this book, steal our hearts, become most people's favorite character. The amount of people scrolling, like, as you're like seeing, you know, CC3 reaction videos on TikTok and Instagram, I don't see a single person who is mad about Lydia or anything that Lydia did. It's fucking masterful. It was masterful.
And I'm loving all of the fan art of her. She's like a blonde Kim Possible, and I just love it so much. I loved getting her POVs, and especially that prologue there, you know, it just like really set up the story there as we're getting her POV and getting a glimpse into what her life has been like for so long. She is such a strong and level-headed and strategic, mature woman. And I think that as a fandom, we really needed that to counter Bryce, which we will definitely get to in a minute here. We clung to Lydia because she was definitely the most likable female character in this book, at least one of the main characters. Of course, we have some great side characters, side female representation, but between the main characters, it is a pretty male, heavily dominated book, and we only have her and Bryce as kind of the two standout females, and she is a much more likable person. Although I will say, Ember, she is my absolute favorite. She is the queen mom of this book, and I love Lydia, but Ember is the queen mom out of anybody.
Oh, her bonus chapter, her and Randall's, was my favorite chapter of the book, like of the entire book.
I just like, I know. Well, it totally, like my daughter, I noticed, I didn't even put it two and together, but she has these adorable little hot pink sneakers. And I was like, oh my gosh, my daughter's like Bryce. And then I was like, oh, if she's like Bryce, then that means I get to be like Ember. And I am totally ready for my Ember era now. So go mom hugs.
You would crush an Ember era. Like, you would do that to a perfect... I'm pretty sure you've been in your Ember era for a while, and now you just get to know what to call it. I love this for you.
Yes, I am in my Ember era. Anyway.
Speaking of moms, I really enjoyed the added character development of Lydia being a mom. To see the scenes with her boys where she's sitting down and just talking to them, whether they were being ass wipes back to her or they were really opening up their hearts at the very end, I was so emotionally invested. And I'm not going to lie, when a character who we perceive as not a mom and then is a mom, whether that's through getting pregnant or in a situation like this, I have never seen it done well in a major book like this, where it's been done in a way that really appeases the fandom and doesn't like massively change the character herself. And this was done perfectly. It just made sense in my mind. I was like, oh my God, yeah, everything that she does, it just totally checks.
It took me a little while to adjust to her being a mom because that really did kind of come out of left field. But after I processed it and understood it, I was definitely on board with how much protecting her children has been a driving factor in her double agent life. It really helped fill in the puzzle pieces to her backstory and explained her motivations and things like that we kind of did need from Lydia to, I'm not going to say like explain herself about how she went from the Hind to Daybright, but we really needed to understand the connection and how her journey went there. So I did like how that went, but it was pretty jarring at first and it took me some getting used to it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's fair. I think that when Rune was trying to be like, oh, like everything makes sense now and da-da, and she calls him the fuck on it, and she's like, no, just because now you know I'm a mom does not mean you suddenly get to like me. Like, I loved that moment so much, because that that explained away that typical trope where suddenly someone has like a motherly energy and then it's like, oh, she's so kind and caring because she's a mom. And like, I love that they addressed that really head on in this book.
I think that was necessary. I will say that. I think that was a necessary addition so that it wasn't so explained away. Yeah,
I agree. There is one thing we're going to talk about, and this is in regards to Throne of Glass. So if you have not read Throne of Glass and you want to go in fully blind, please skip ahead 5 minutes and we will be with you in 5 minutes. Okay, so when she looks at one of her sons and she says Brannon is one of Aelin's predecessors. Now, this is one of those moments that caused a lot of people to be like, and like go furiously Google or like stop and like reread. That was a really cool moment. And we already had ideas that Aelin and Lydia were somehow connected. There's a ring that Lydia wears that is wildly close to the descriptions of Rowan's ring.
Well, okay, again, I have no context here in this spoilery talk section here, so I'm kind of blind here. But I actually did see that a few TikTokers were comparing the rings, and they are close, but they are distinctly different. So there are similarities between the rings, but readers have determined that they are not the same.
Okay, so that's interesting. I have yet to see those, but I love that because timeline-wise, it made absolutely no sense how Lydia is the age that she is, and also a descendant of Aelin and what we would gather Rowan in that case as well. So I'm glad that is not the case because that was really throwing my timeline into a fucking loop-de-loop.
Well, and I'm going to, again, I am just going off of what I have read about from the reactions and seen and all of that kind of stuff, is that it's my understanding that Lydia is a descendant of Brannon, but that does not automatically mean that she's directly related to Aelin, because somebody else was saying that she actually thinks that she's related to Manon, which don't tell me how that all works together because I have no idea. But I don't know.
I'm going to keep my mouth shut just because I want you to not be spoiled in this moment. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and that sounds great. Another thing to connect her to Aelin, though, is that she is also a deer shifter, and Terrasen, the stag, all that kind of stuff. And then last but not least, she's a fucking fire wielder. I don't know what else to call her. And we love our fire-breathing bitch queen. So I
did know that part.
I'm so happy for you. I really need you to get through Tog so that we can talk openly about the Maasverse. We're almost there.
For instance, with that bonus episode that we are doing in March, I will finish Tog before then so that I can be fully participating in this conversation here.
My goal is to also reread Tog by that time also. So I actually know, because like apparently I just missed a lot when I read Tog the first time. So I'm very excited. Now, just so we finish this up within our 5-minute time window that I gave everyone, I really loved Lydia being an obvious parallel to the Aelin line or the Brannon line in Throne of Glass. There is another line that she is compared to also that I'm not going to say just with Lexi on the line right now. So there's people talking about it on the internet. That's all I will say. I don't want to hinder Lexi's reading experience. But I loved seeing this other line of Fae, because we had the ACOTAR Fae, but now we got to see the Throne of Glass Fae as well primarily in Lydia. We also got to see it in the shifters for the wolves as well. So it was just done so well. It was beautiful.
I will say I wish I had read Tog before CC just so that I could get this context. Is it absolutely necessary for my reading experience like it was to read ACOTAR first? No, but I'm definitely feeling that FOMO. I'll say that.
I did that video where it was like, what order would you read the Maasverse in? And I put CC2. And now after reading House of Flame and Shadow, I'm like, I might want to actually move Throne of Glass to number 2 and then Crescent City be the end. But you know what? That's a video for another day.
Well, the reason why was also because of all the hype around CC. So exactly. You did explain if you want to be part of the hype, then you can read CC first before Tog. But anyway, let's move on to another character. Ethan. Now, with the whole context of the book, I think I'm actually in the minority that I really liked Ethan's arc toward the end, once when you take the full book into context here. I definitely wanted to punch him in the face in part 1 and most of part 2. He made just one stupid decision after another and wallowed in self-pity, and I just kept wanting to whack him on the head and tell him to get his shit together, because I actually really do like him, and I have felt sympathetic and invested in his character arc since midway through House of Sky and Breath. And his blind trust in Sigrid was just questionable at very best. That's the nicest way I can put it. It does, however, go to show how desperate he was to get rid of Sabine. Anyone would be better than her, even a Reaper, according to him. And he was extremely short-sighted, time and time again, but he was just clinging to this hope, and I really felt for him with all of that.
Interesting. I, too, actually am in the minority with you, and I did actually really like Ethan's character. But, like you, I was infuriated with him for most of part 1 and part 2 because of the stupid decisions he kept making over and over again. But I took this as fitting the reluctant leader role, just aggressively fitting this role. He wanted so badly to not step into this alpha role. I almost said alpha hole. Step into this alpha role. And he was so desperate for someone else to be in charge, especially after losing the guidepost that was Connor for him. Sigrid
and Danica. And Danica.
Yeah. Well, and Bryce. I'd even throw Bryce in there too. Like because when he was kicked out of his pack, he immediately found a leader in Bryce again. Then when he was not kicked out, but he chose to leave Bryce's apartment, he found a leader in Rune and Deck and Flynn. And he's just always been sitting to the sidelines and like letting other people lead, which is ironic because the Prime in CC2 was like, you have what it takes to be an alpha. And he's like, me? What are you talking about? Not me. I think Sigrid, for having the name Fendir, was the only reason he threw his blind trust in her. She was a bitch at best and did not show any fucking promise. She didn't know what a shower was for the longest time. She lived in a bathtub her entire life, so it's not her fault. Like, it's not her fault for just not understanding any context clues on how to be a member of society. And I wasn't mad when Ethan killed her, if I'm being totally honest. I was mad, however, when he desperately tried to resurrect her and make her a Reaper, the head of the wolves. Woof. Get it?
It wasn't until Ethan took the antidote for the parasite and gained his full power that he got his head out of his ass. And I think that's the point. Once he leveled up in powers, which, by the way, I love that concept, leveling up, as Bryce would say, he found that clarity and purpose. And that's why I'm saying I liked his arc with the context of the whole book. I saw someone compare him to Simba from The Lion King, and I really liked that. I was like, yes. I think that's very fitting, yes. Especially with the Prime being, like Rafiki, where it's like, come on, it's your destiny, you got it. And he's like, no, I can't do it. And then he, of course, does anyway. But yeah, if you kind of think about Ethan like Simba, it's like, oh, okay, like I get him a little bit more there. Maybe Ethan didn't have clarity in his next steps, but at least once when he took the antidote, he had the confidence to take a step forward just in general. And he had his head held high instead of being this distressed and lost puppy he was for the better part of a book and a half. Although I do agree with other readers who say that he failed up. Even once when he had his powers, even once when he kind of gained a little bit of that confidence, he failed up. That is a very accurate statement. I finished the book excited for Ethan's story and his new role as Prime, and I'm so proud of him for finally embracing this leadership role. Did he kind of stumble into this Prime situation? Yes, but I also don't think he's done proving himself, and I'm most excited for the continuation of his story in the next book, House of Many Waters, especially with the whole dynamic of the other wolves not really wanting to be followers of his.
I'm also excited to see the love story between him and Perry, because I'm strongly assuming that's going to be what happens. I love that Perry, the book ended with Flynn and Perry making eyes at each other and Ethan getting jealous. And I'm like, oh, this will be a fun dynamic. I can't wait for this. I am also excited to see how the wolves operate now that there is this level of elemental magic at play. Like, will there now be factions of like the fire wolves, the ice wolves, the whatever, I see this as the opportunity for the Throne of Glass world crossover to really take center stage in Crescent City books. So I'm really excited for Ethan's part of what we're assuming will be called House of Many Waters.
But I'll be honest, I'll tell you who I'm not excited about in the next book.
You and me both.
All right, Tharion. Let's talk about Tharion. I need to say this just to get it off my chest. Tharion really needs to be punched in the face, and not only that, but he just needs to get ditched. I agree with his own inner monologue. He is indeed a loser. And while I had the tiniest bit of interest in him towards the end, I still roll my eyes every time it switches over to his perspective. Like, I felt so bad for his new wife. I knew the alternative was a murder twin, but what a wet blanket of a husband. His POV got a little more interesting once when he married Sathya, but honestly, it's because she was the more interesting character between them, not him. Like, he has to be a POV character for some reason, right? It feels like there's a lot of setup for his character in the next book, especially with the way that it ended on a cliffhanger for him. But I'm really struggling to get excited about the next book for his sake, because I just want to DNF him. Not Crescent City or any of the other characters, but just him.
Cackling, but honestly, I feel very similar to you. I couldn't tell you anything interesting that happened to Tharion before he married Sathya. Maybe the fact that he had an acid trip from the Viper Queen's blood, but that's about it. And that is even just because I just reread it.
But also, he defected from 3 queens. So it's like a lot happened with him, but the whole point is that he's still boring.
He gives me like pretty pretty boy who peaked in high school vibes. Like, that's what I get from him.
Yes.
To be honest, I liked him way more as a side character in, you know, like CC 1 and 2 as that like shameless flirt, because he wasn't trying to be a good guy. He was calling her legs and talking about going through her underwear drawer, for God's sake. And he was interesting then. I loved it. I loved how, and Ashy on TikTok actually brought this up and it had me cackling. And like you just said, Lex, Tharion deflected 3 queens in the span of 10 days. He should have been way more interesting. Like, why was that not interesting for us as readers? His character, as well as Ethan's, I'm trying to think of this analytically, and I think actually Ashy brought this up on TikTok as well. He, as well as Ethan's POVs, were here to balance out the story for us.
Yes, exactly. There's that argument that we needed these idiots stumbling around to balance out the extra powerful in the know main characters that we got.
Because was his character interesting? Abso-fucking-lutely not. He, again, deflected 3 queens, and honestly, no one gives a shit about him. Like, that really says something. He's also the luckiest son of a bitch there ever was. But given the fact that his story of our CC3 characters, it was left the most open, we can strongly assume that he is going to be the main protagonist of the next CC book. Now, what I could see happening, and I'm going to give Tharion the benefit of the doubt here, I could see House of Many Waters being a Nesta, a Court of Silver Flames level story arc. Personally, I really liked Nesta in ACOTAR. I was not jazzed about her in Frost and Starlight, and I was even less jazzed about her at the beginning of Silver Flames. But damn, does SJM know how to write a redemption arc. There's a reason Nesta is now one of my favorite characters in all of these universes. To be honest, I trust Sarah. I trust Sarah to know what she's doing with his redemption arc. I just hope she knows he needs one. You know what I mean? Like,
that's so interesting that you bring up Nesta, because I have a quick story to tell. I had a very heated book debate with my very dear friend last night when she was over for the Super Bowl. We were talking about CC3. She's on chapter 70 right now. And I mentioned how Tharion is just like a wet blanket and I can't stand him. And she stands up from the couch and goes on a full-blown defense about Tharion that I have never heard from anyone. And it's like literally like it's overtime during the Super Bowl right now. And our poor men are like trying to watch this very intense game. And we're just yelling at each other about Tharion and whether he's like a worthwhile character or not. And while I still stand by my feelings about him, she brought up some really great points that I want to share here. And it's very along the lines of what you were just saying, Nicole. She related Tharion and this rock bottom he's in. She says that he's boring because he's a very depressed character and he's so self-loathing. She's like, he reminds me so much of Nesta and her redemption arc. And my friend, she also really resonates with Nesta and is the biggest Nesta defender. So she really saw a lot of Nesta in Tharion here when we hated Nesta when she was at her lowest. That made me rethink him a little bit, because my friend is right. We may hate him, but that doesn't mean he is someone who should be hated. And I'm going to be just very interested with where his character arc goes, because we've seen absolute rock bottom. And now, oh my God, like we are beyond ready to take this redemption arc journey with him. Game of Thrones spoilers a little bit here. He reminds me a lot of Theon's redemption arc, because it is like, you did not need to take this long and we did not need to hate you and you did not need to hit the bottomest of rock bottom like 5 different times before you rise up to the occasion. So I definitely see Tharion as much more of a Theon-esque character here.
I just hope it doesn't take him getting kicked in the nuts and then realizing, oh, I am worth something. And that's what his redemption arc is. I'm looking at you, Theon Greyjoy. Good Lord.
Man, yeah, we could talk all about him as well. But
that's not a fun episode. That's not a fun episode of podcasting.
Let's talk about Bryce, because I know you all have been waiting for us to talk about her. Oh boy, what can we say about Bryce, Nicole? Like a lot of other readers, I loved Bryce most in CC1 when she was on her hero's journey. I also really related a lot to her in CC1 as someone who has also lost my best friend, and that was just a gut-wrenching journey about her grief and rising up to the occasion. And Light It Up is just like, it still sends chills down my spine. Like, I loved Bryce so much in CC1. In this book, it was admittedly hard to root for Bryce, partly because, for a lot of reasons, but partly because her character felt inconsistent. She'll be super mean one moment, then backtrack or write what she has said, but then again, she's super rude and inconsistent again in a few pages. And I couldn't keep up with her train of thought, and that made me feel disconnected from her. She was also very secretive within her own POV, so it was hard to trust her when the writing shifted to her POV. She always had something up her sleeve, which I wasn't opposed to, but it wasn't clever like it had been before. It felt like we as the readers were getting betrayed by her because she was lying within her own narrative. When she was in the Autumn King's house, as a perfect example, even in her own POV, it was like she didn't mean to be there. And as we all learn, like, it was some big master plan that she had. And it's like, I would have liked her to trust us a little bit more. So it was just like all for shock value. And it didn't hit because I didn't trust her. I just couldn't fully get behind her and a lot of her decisions in part 2 and even half of part 3. Although I will say I really liked Bryce in the final Asteri battle. She felt like the old Bryce that we've known and loved. But specifically in part 2, Bryce, she's dismissive of her friends. She's very dismissive of Hunt when she was the most loyal and the best friend in book 1. Yes, defending the world and getting rid of the Asteri is extremely important. It's number 1 priority. But she seems to lose sight of why she's doing this, why she's fighting this battle in the first place, which is to protect her loved ones. With all of these complaints, let's just try to look at why her character is being this way, because a lot of us really are frustrated with Bryce, and I just want to look at it from an analytical lens. Bryce is the chosen one, and she recognizes this as her responsibility to rise up against the Asteri, and she shoulders that burden. She swiftly takes the lead after she embraced her powers in the last book. She doesn't feel like she belongs to any one race either. She doesn't identify as Fae because of how much she hates her father, but part of her journey is accepting who she really is, what her mission is, what her purpose is, and we can see how far she has come and grown into herself since we were first introduced to her in CC1. Did we see all of it on page, maybe like we'd hope that we would from our female main character? No, and that is the problem that I was just saying about with her in this book. She's hot-headed, she's secretive, she's impulsive. That's actually one of the reasons we liked her in CC1. But this attitude dominates the rest of her dynamic personality, and we're not on board with this character development we see from her to be able to root for her in that same way. I loved how Reese describes her in a bonus chapter. It perfectly sums her up and actually reminded me of why we do love her. Quote, she's soft-hearted yet ruthless, scheming yet impulsive, determined and stubborn, and with a dangerous tendency towards recklessness. This is Bryce in a nutshell. And when we first saw it all on display in one page, it was a lot. But when it's describing her just as a whole, this line right here made me be like, okay, maybe I have been a little harsh on her. And I'm more frustrated with moments than her entire character arc, because I love how her character is described in that way. But when I see it all crammed into one page, it's too much.
I think it makes 100% sense, and I'm agreeing with you wholeheartedly. One of the things that made me need to step away from this book was because of Bryce and her choices at the end of part 1. The fact that she is always standing up for the innocents. She is a whatever it takes attitude. I mean, she runs after that one section of Lunathian in CC1 to protect the innocent humans. She is always someone who protects those whether they deserve it or not. And then she lets loose a fucking Asteri on an innocent world. That was unfucking forgivable. It made no sense in my head. And
I think it was actually very on character with Bryce. But I think that she was reckless enough and impulsive enough to think, oh, well, I'll fix this. I'll be able to kill her anyway. She kind of has that confidence that she can take care of it. But she really wanted this information. And in order to get that information, she needed to tap into the Asteri here. And then again, it's that impulsive nature of hers. And then she just kind of she has the confidence that it will work out. And of course it did, because it's kind of like she just kind of knew it would.
Interesting. I think that, yes, there is a level of recklessness. I mean, when she, calls upon, I think it's in CC1, it might be, no, it is in CC1, when she calls upon, I think it's Adis, when her and Hunt are, using black salts and all this kind of stuff. She does this regularly, but not with something the level of Asteri. And that's where I was like, whoa, what? This is something that could literally wipe this entire planet clean off the map, and yet you are here opening it up. Here's the second part to this, because then Nesta kills this Asteri, or this quote-unquote Asteri, we still don't know. And then Bryce just yeets out of this world and goes back to Lunathi and is like, how do we kill the Asteri? We need to kill the Asteri. And I'm like, you were just with someone who did it in front of your own eyes. And yet she was like, we need to kill the Asteri. We need to kill the Asteri. Like, Bryce is such a people person. And I am still obviously, I'm still very worked up by her choices and how she just felt like she, at least in my opinion, she was acting very out of the character who... I love Bryce. She was quickly becoming one of my favorite SJM women, and yet I really can't get behind her in some of the choices that she made, and don't even get me started on how she treats Hunt in part 2. A lot of people are saying that she was trying to be like Aelin level secretive, chess playing, but it fell flat in House of Flame and Shadow, and honestly, I have to agree. Bryce is not Aelin. Bryce is funny and witty, and not saying that Aelin isn't, but she's this like sass monster, and she just didn't really feel like she was leaning into her strengths in this book. I know there was supposed to be some character development for her in this book, but I honestly was so emotionally burned with her, and the fact that she took Azriel's dagger, like, honestly, I'm okay with it now because she brought it back and da-da-da-da-da. I, like, Lexi, I was, like, when you finally got to that point, I was talking to you, I was angry.
Because it's so funny because you and I have such different opinions about the end of part 1. I like read it and I was kind of like, oh, okay, cool. Like, on to the next part here. And like, you were like, I couldn't read the book for a whole day. And it's just, again, like, I love our different perspectives because I did not have that same level of aggression towards Bryce from that part. I did it with other parts, but not part 1 because I understood where all of the characters were coming from in my own head. So yeah.
That's fair. I think I'm still very emotionally burned by Bryce. I don't think I have anything nice to say about her in this part. I will later, but of our main characters, Bryce was one of my least favorite, and that was really disappointing and shocking because I love Bryce. I love Bryce.
Well, let's talk about Hunt now, because we can't talk about Bryce without talking about Hunt, of course. Now, is Hunt one of the most exciting book boyfriends? No. Like, he peaked in book 1, in my opinion. I still love him, but he's not on the same podium as some of the other book boyfriends that we all know and love. That's just how he is, though. He is a soldier. He wants to live a normal life and a quiet life, and he wants to heal from his centuries of trauma and just have babies with Bryce and have a nice life. He wants a boring life, which I have children. That's not necessarily a boring life, but it's a normal life. You know what I mean? That's the point of what he's after in this book specifically. And there was so much opportunity to see Hunt's arc with his trauma dealing from before to get to his happily ever after. And yeah, it was there to an extent, especially with his pushback and his fear of what the crew, specifically Bryce, was doing to overcome the Asteri. But Bryce steamrolled him, and not in a good way like we thought Lydia did with the book, but in a bad way of, don't do this to your mate and husband. And she pretty much told him to suck it up. The way that she dismissed Hunt's trauma and his very real feelings, I believe that it did his character development a disservice. And when I say character development, I realize this book was over the span of less than 10 days. So there's not a lot of real character development that can truly happen in that time span for any of our characters. But of course, it's big events. It's a lot of stuff going on. Of course, there's going to be character development. It is a story. You got to have character development. And he had every opportunity, and Bryce squashed it for him. And I think that also overall, his personality and his individual journey, it is dimmed, so to speak, to let Bryce's shine. She has that strong personality, and if he was one of our shadow daddies, they would have been butting heads so much, and I don't think they would have been a good match. Bryce needs a mate who follows her, who doesn't have much of a strong-willed personality as her, and that is Hunt. That's Hunt. That's who he wants to be. That's why they work well together. Can he become the Umbra Mortis and be super scary? Absolutely. But all he wants is to be just Hunt. And with all of that said, that is why their mated bond is my least favorite of the SJM series. Though I also say that halfway through TOG, as you all know, so I don't have the full context of TOG to make that comparison. I get the way Hunt is because he needs to compliment Bryce, and she has enough headstrong personality for both of them. I still love Hunt, though. I still loved getting his POV. I felt bad for him because he was so frustrated. Bryce was doing her own thing, and he kind of just had no choice but to be along for the ride. Now, Does this perspective change in part 3? Yes. But for a guy who just endured some real torture, again, in the Asiri dungeons, his mate, she just belittled him in a way poor, I just want to be normal Hunt, he just didn't need it. So that's I'll get off my pedestal there about Hunt.
I thought Hunt part 1 was really interesting.
Yes.
Particularly because he had a fucking storyline. He was seeing the Prince of Hell in the dungeon. I loved the bonding between Baxian and Rune and, Hunt in the dungeons. Like, I also just love a torture sequence, so take this with a grain of salt. But I agree on the part 2 Hunt. I thought we were gearing for Hunt and Bryce to break up. I'm going to be totally honest. And that's not just because I loved the idea of like a cross universe mating bond. I loved the idea of, Bryce and possibly Azriel or stuff like that. That didn't mean I didn't like Hunt though. I still really liked Hunt and Bryce together. But with how they were fighting and how they got married. They got married. I don't remember them actually getting married. I remember them talking about it in CC2, but she was like, "I don't see a ring, Athalar meh." And he's
I remember them picking out rings. Like, I do remember, I have a vague memory of that. So I feel like in their terms, when you're mated, then you're married. Like, it's kind of like
so.
one meets the other one.
But it wasn't like a, Rhysand and Feyre going to the High Priestess and not only swearing her in as his wife and mate formally, but then also swearing her in as High Lady. Like, that was a moment. And even though, yes, it technically happened off page, it was still a moment for our story. And I was just kind of like, oh, okay, I guess that's just a thing now. But their reunion, specifically Bryce and Hunt's reunion, it just felt really flat. It felt like kind of out of character. Bryce is then treating him how she treated him after he's been tortured for days. Like, it was just very different from the SJM romances that we know and that we love, that feel operatic in nature, right? And again, I'm saying this as someone who loved Hunt and Bryce up until this book. It felt really just flat kiss and make up, and then he's like back to being her soldier by part 3. It was just, I really liked Hunt. I'm excited to dive into his, Princes of Hell and his test tube baby that he called himself. And I think that part was interesting, but it did get very lost in the shuffle because it was in another, here's a huge info dump. Let's sit down and just like dump all this info on you. Someone on TikTok, I can't remember the name, I'm so sorry, but they were saying how all of the info dumps were very tell, don't show. And the second they said that, I was like, ooh, yeah, that's it. That's very true. Now, all of this to say in regards to Hunt, there's one moment in particular that was just so beautiful that gave me chills every time I read it. And that's with him in the mech suits with Shahar at the end. That was such a gorgeous full circle moment for Hunt.
It's so funny because, yeah, we just talked all about Hunt and mostly about him and Bryce. And it's like, oh my gosh, we didn't even really touch on his Hell origin story. And I thought it was fascinating. But like you mentioned, it got completely lost in the shuffle. Like, when I reflect back on this book, like, that is a part that I have to actively remind myself that happened. And I don't even really have much of a reaction to it because, like, oh yeah, like, it was just like, oh yeah, that happened, and then move on sort of thing.
And it's funny because it was such a huge theory. It was such a huge question mark for people coming into this book. And it did feel like it was kind of like, oh yeah, you're a son. Okay, but then there's the hugest other thing for Bryce. Like, it's this huge info dump for Bryce to know. And if I was Hunt, I'd be like, you just told me my parentage. I'm sorry. Can we focus on that for a second? I'd feel a little bit like, yeah, she's important, but like, that was a huge thing you just kind of rolled over.
Well, and that just like goes right back to my point about Hunt in general, is that he is there to be Bryce's supporting partner. He is literally created to be her soldier. Yeah. And it's okay that his personality is like that. However, we all love and support him, and the way that Bryce treats him is not okay. Anyway. Yeah. Overall, the main characters in this book were very much a hit or miss. Some were a hit, like Rune and Lydia, and other words were a total miss that we already talked about. I love the universe crossovers and all of the lore, but I wish that we were more invested in some of these characters. And I really had to actively and consciously put myself in their shoes to relate and understand why they're doing what they're doing, rather than just like bashing on them. It's like, we really do try to sit back and figure out why they're doing what they're doing. And it was a little bit harder than usual with that. However, before we get into like the different part sections, we have to talk about some of our side characters. Because, like, for instance, I love Fury. Fury is just awesome in general. Oh my gosh.
I love Fury. I was so excited for Fury whenever I saw her name show up on the page. And then it just whisked on by. So I was kind of like, wait, Fury, no. It felt like she got a little sidelined. But I was excited to see her show up in the story. I just didn't expect that it would be so fleeting.
While I appreciate that Fury protected characters, had her role, let's do her a little bit more service than just being a glorified babysitter. Like, give me more Fury. Come on.
I loved Hypaxia and her storyline, her becoming the House of Flame and Shadow head after killing the Underking. Like, it was so good. Even though she wasn't in this book a lot, she really showed up at the second half of, part 2, or not even second half, I think like 2/3 of the way into part 2. And then, of course, her major role with the antidote in part 3. The time that we did get with her, I love Hypaxia. I have to keep reminding myself that her and Lydia are sisters. So that was funny, but I'm
real
really
quickly,
glad we had her.
the way that Lydia was proud of her sister for finding the antidote, because like they never have had a sisterly blonde whatsoever. Like I think they met at the ball at the masquerade in CC2, and so like the like shining little sisterly bond coming through. I loved that. I love that so much. I mostly agree. I wish that we saw more of her character development on page. I wanted more from Hypaxia in general. I've just been holding out for her since her character was just really beautifully set up in CC1, and I felt like she got totally sidelined in CC2. And for being as powerful as Hypaxia is and as good at what she does, I was a little bit, maybe disappointed is the right word, of her role in the resurrection debacles. She did pull off the antidote very quickly. I was very proud of her for that. I loved that she redeemed herself there. And I'm really rooting for her now that the Underking is gone and she's now the head of the House of Flame and Shadow. But I'm going to need a whole lot more of this, of her relationship with the Archangel, of her backstory with the witches, and all of it. Like, I need more of her and all of her story in the next book. I would hope that we get her POV. I'm going to assume she also will finesse the antidote so it permanently brings your power back and it's more stable. Remember, it's only temporary. She doesn't know for how long, whether it's a few days, a few weeks, even up to a month, but it is not permanent. So she needs to figure out how to make that so. I definitely foresee that being a major storyline in the next CC book. Also, how is this new world going to be with such powerful beings? How will this impact the humans? There are so many more questions about how the anecdote and the consequential powers will factor into the next book, House of Many Waters, but I'm digressing from our side character conversation.
We need to talk about Jessica really quickly because we'll get into her more in our part 3 discussion. But I've always loved Jessica. She's fascinating. She's just kind of in the background, maybe not so much in CC1, but definitely in CC2. But she's always had such an air of mystery, especially her epilogue with Adis at the end of CC1. And we finally got her backstory, and it was so not expected. I was not expecting it to be as pure and beautiful as it was, but it was, and it was perfect. I loved it.
You know, I think of Jessica very much as Meredith from The Devil Wears Prada.
Yes.
Is that her name? Yes. I was also all about Jessica and her subplot and the backstory. She's a fascinating character. She was born as a human before Midgard was overtaken by the Asteri 15,000 years ago. She was a priestess at the Great Library of Parthos, and she was present when the library was famously attacked. You know all of those books that she was protecting in CC1. Well, she was the one who originally smuggled them out of the library to preserve them. I loved the foreshadowing line as well about how she doesn't want to live forever, but she isn't ready to continue aging and therefore face death until the books are in a safe world. And then she gets her wish, and I thought that was such a beautiful moment. It wasn't a little bit cheesy, sure, but I loved it. I was all there for it.
Also, her time with Ethan in part 2 and 3 was just perfect when she made him pay his dues in order to talk to her. She's just so sassy, and I loved her. I loved her in this book. And last on the side, now obviously it's a CC novel. There's so many side characters, but we're just able to only cover a few of them. And we have to talk about Ember and Randall because even though we have such a short time with them, they are some of my favorite characters. They are the POVs of my favorite chapter in the entire fucking book. And I loved the time we got to spend with them.
Ember and Nesta are the mom and adopted daughter duo I never knew I needed. I did not know how badly I needed that until I saw it on page. oh my God, Ember is the best. She has always been one of my favorites in this series. She's the sassy mom, but she's also like got a little bit of like that controlling aspect, like, you know, like kind of a bit of a helicopter parent, but she also knows and trusts her daughter. And I just like, and then Randall like being like the dad, and I just like, oh my God, I love it. I just love everything about her.
And Randall and Reese like bonding over being protective dads. Like it was just, oh my God, it was so good. I loved their character. And I have some feelings about them being put up as collateral, but I'm so grateful because of what it unlocked in our story. Like
I could literally, like, we should just have a whole podcast episode about Ember and Randall. Like, truly. I love them so much. We'll talk more about them here as we continue on.
Yeah. Well, before we get into discussing these notably very different 3 parts of this book, I first want to address the amount of criticism this book got in regard to the ACOTAR involvement, because naturally we're going to be talking a lot about it in our part 1 discussion. And I'm going to be a little blunt, because personally, I do not think it is fair for a lot of the book talk, bookstagrammers, people, creators, chastising people for being disappointed in this book and the level of ACOTAR involvement in it because they were, quote, expecting it to be ACOTAR 6. Mainly, I do not agree with this statement because no one was expecting it to be all ACOTAR and no Lunathian. However, given where CC2 left off, of course, the last 2 years, people have been theorizing about how these 2 worlds are going to meld together. Who did not see a theory about Cassie and Azrael and the Valkyries taking over Lunathian and figuring out how guns work? Who didn't think about Rune and Reese meeting and basically it being the Spider-Man theme where he's pointing at his body double? Not to mention the inclusion of Rifthold and the other Tog characters.
Oh, and don't forget about the Dust Court either. Like, there's, of course, the Dust Court whole thing.
Like the resurrection of the Dust Court and Bryce becoming High Lady. Like, there were all of these theories around the ACOTAR and the Tog involvement in CC3. You could not scroll through a theory list in regards to House and Flame and Shadow without seeing at least half of those theories being around the ACOTAR characters or even some of the Tog characters. So no, this was not expected to be ACOTAR 6, but there was a level of, and Listen with Brit on TikTok put this perfectly, Avengers Endgame expectation attached to it. This was the book that we were expecting to meld these 3 worlds together and be like the big battle with all 3 of these storylines. So when Bryce left Prithian on horrific terms at the end of part 1, a lot of people, and myself included, were sad and frustrated because of all the hype of these worlds colliding. Luckily, there's that beautiful full circle moment back with Nesta twice at the very end, and of course with Ember and Nesta, like we just discussed, and Reese and Randall and all that kind of stuff. So if you were one of these people and you were disappointed or even just, hell, bummed about the lack of the Maasverse madness crossover, I want to just say you are not alone. No one should make you feel bad about wanting to see some of your favorite characters interacting in new worlds and with these other characters that you love. Most people had 2 years of thinking of these ways that these 3 worlds could collide. So of course we were hyped and there were different levels of hype in all these crossovers. So with that said, no, this was not the Avengers level endgame. And you know what? That is okay. It's just adjusting our expectations. And it was still so exciting to see characters interacting. I mean, again, Ember and Nesta, what a fucking chef's kiss moment. And it was thrilling to see the lineage from Tog coming into play with the shifters and Aelin and Lydia and all that kind of stuff. I did just want to address this real quick, this like ACOTAR 6 level shade that I've seen from a lot of creators at the top of the internet. These stories are all beloved with characters who are double, triple, uberly beloved, and they're as real to us as our own selves on some level. And we are going to have our own expectations and opinions. So with that said, internet kindness, people, it is free.
While it's impossible for us to cover everything from this book, we've got to talk about some key themes and scenes from each of the 3 parts of this book. Part 1, the drop. We can't wait any longer. We have to fully dive in and talk about Bryce being in Prithian.
Especially after the anticipation of CC2's ending, this was the highly anticipated moment that so many of us were waiting for. The chapter 1 opening scene was chilling and perfect. Getting to see Rhys, Amren, and Azriel interrogate someone, but from the prisoner's point of view, was amazing. Now, a lot of people were frustrated with Bryce not immediately trusting these beloved ACOTAR characters, but to be honest, her distrust felt very on par, and I think she did a great job of explaining it when we were in her POVs. We have to remember that less than a day ago for her, she was at the Asteri Palace, and she learned that basically everything she's been told, it's been a lie. Her trust in these all-powerful people is completely shattered. We cannot forget, Rhys is the most powerful High Lord, the most cunning High Lord. He is the most powerful High Lord for a reason. She can feel the power rippling off him. If she didn't distrust him, I would have found that weird, given everything she's been through. Speaking of Rhys, I do love that he asked for consent before looking into her mind. Like, that's the Rhys we know and love. Yes, he's definitely getting seen through a different point of view than Feyre, which, you know, to be expected. But I love seeing him and all these different nuances of Rhys's character.
Oh, and I loved all the little nuggets from the ACOTAR series that were just sprinkled throughout this crossover. Like the mention that Nesta's sister killed the Mittengard worm.
I still only see the Alaskan bullworm from SpongeBob SquarePants, and imagine Nesta putting on the mask and killing the Alaskan bullworm. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful mental image. I will never regret it.
Another wonderful little nugget was Nyx. I am a little bit sad that we didn't get Nyx, but we did get an amazing line about Rhys being an overprotective dad. It was later on in part 3. I will take that mention of Nyx. Absolutely.
There were several characters in the ACOTAR verse that we didn't get to spend a lot of time with. I was a little bummed about that. I mean, Feyre is front and center of this list. Like, she was the pillar of the ACOTAR world for the first 3 books, and she did feel very sidelined in this book specifically. And also she wasn't really present as much as you'd expect a all-powerful High Lady to be. But, you know, I get it. Her son is 6 months old. Like, she's probably doing mom things, and that's okay.
I do have a question about how babies in the ACOTAR world age, because we know that they age slower. So my question is, are they a newborn for more like a year or 2 instead of just a few months? And like, how does that all work?
I guess you just don't sleep for like 25 years. Like
poor people.
Speaking of Nyx, like at first I was bummed that we didn't get to see him on page, but then I also thought about, we haven't seen him on page other than, you know, his very traumatic birth at the end of Silver Flames. It would make sense for him to not be on page for the first time for us as readers in a CC book. Like, it would make much more sense for us to be introduced to him fully in the next ACOTAR book. So I was bummed, but then I was like, no, I kind of get that from a storytelling perspective.
Yep. Exactly. And then, of course, not so much nuggets, but like gigantic big, here's on a silver platter, the dread troves, especially the mask.
Yes, the fact that when she wasn't taking off the mask and Azriel was like, think of Cassian, and that didn't do it. Think of Gwen and Emery, that didn't do it. Her sisters, of course, that didn't do it. But Nyx is what did it. That is some big anti-energy here, and I'm so about it. I loved seeing the crossovers of the magic and how, you know, with the maid and the dread trove. And actually, shouts to Sealy Queen real quick on our Discord, because she pointed out that in Silver Flames, Amren is talking to Cassian, and she's like, I'd be careful when you're fucking Nesta, because, you know, some of that maid power might be transferred over to you. What happens in part 3 with Hunt and Bryce? A part of her maid energy gets transferred into him, and that's why he can wear the mask. So at first I was like, why can like Bryce and Hunt just wear this mask and be totally fine? But then I thought about it in that kind of realm of crossover, and I was like, oh no, actually we are kind of set up for that. I do like that a lot.
That is interesting. There is definitely some criticism about how big of a deal it is for Nesta to be able to put the mask on and to be able to essentially conquer death by wearing that mask. And then Bryce and Hunt can essentially willy-nilly put it on. Yes, needs to keep the plot moving forward. Absolutely. That is one big, gigantic part of it. I do think, however, and I saw this, somebody else say this on TikTok, and I'm so sorry, it starts to kind of bleed all together at a certain point. But they were saying that they believed that the reason it was so difficult for Nesta Nesta to be able to like conquer that mask is because death is part of her in a way that it isn't with Bryce and Hunt. Bryce and Hunt are not always trying to conquer the death within themselves. They are not having that same inner battle that Nesta really and truly is. And also, I mean, think about the cauldron and how she is made. And it's like death is like literally a part of her. And so she really, even though it calls to her and she's able to use the mask in a way that others are not in her world, it is still for lack of a better word, a trigger for her in a way that it isn't possible to be for Hunt or Bryce. It made it make sense a little bit more to me. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an explanation.
I really appreciate that. That does make a lot more sense in my opinion. And speaking of things like the mask, we get confirmation that the horn in Bryce's back is a dread trove item. We highly inferred this, but I got chills during this confirmation. It was so good.
I loved seeing classic Nesta, you know, like where it's like she doesn't really smile and Bryce is like even noticing it's like she's not somebody who smiles kind of thing, right? And like she's got like those like super short one-liners that it's classic Nesta. But we also really see that softer side in her that we really saw in Silver Flames with her budding friendship with Gwen and Emery. And of course, then the need for a mother's love. Like we saw the whole range of Nesta's character. And I loved that so much. A lot of people are saying they didn't even like Nesta at the end of Silver Flames. But this is the book that they actually started appreciating Nesta's character.
Well, on that front, like Nesta is a very polarizing character. And I saw someone on the internet say, or it was a trend that was going on for a while, so I don't know who originated it, but it was basically saying you either love Nesta because you were a Nesta, or you hate Nesta because you've dealt with a Nesta. And I was like, maybe. I don't really know if I could ever say that I was a Nesta, but I still love her character. And I do believe seeing an outside point of view from someone who wasn't obviously herself that we get in Silver Flames, and someone who wasn't her sister, because I love you so much. When we were 16, it wasn't exactly the happiest of households, you know, it was a very different place. And I loved getting to see it from a total stranger's point of view. It was beautiful. We see how trusting, how caring, how big-hearted she is. And while still being a badass, while still being this hard ass that we know Nesta to be, and standing up for those that she loves. Nesta is a balance of a lot of really difficult things. And I think that SJM, she's admitted that Nesta is one of her favorite characters. And I think it shows. I think it shows on page beautifully. All in all, I think that going back into Prythian and having so much of this in part one, like, it made me so excited for our ACOTAR deep dives. Like, it made me so excited to get into it next week. Yeah, we record episode 1 next week. I'm so freaking excited.
I am too. I'm rereading all of the books right now. I'm trying to finish them before we start our deep dive. I literally have it on 2.0 speed right now, like just like speed reading through them. But I can't wait to reread A Court of Silver and Flames again. It's going to be like reading a whole new book now that we have all this additional lore info. And so I'm so excited to reread that book, especially now with the CC3 context. And for our listeners here, friendly reminder that we are starting our ACOTAR deep dive on Monday, February 26th. Every week, we'll dive into a stretch of chapters, beginning with A Court of Thorns and Roses, like Nicole was just saying. We're going to be doing our first recording next week, and eventually we will work our way up to Silver Flames.
In our ACOTAR deep dives, all 5 books of them, we're going to start with that fun recap. If you've been familiar with us with Iron Flame and Fourth Wing, we did our battle brief. It will be called something different for ACOTAR, so stay tuned. We'll be doing a fun recap of what happened in these chapters. Then we'll share our insights, our character analyses, our foreshadowing, our theories, and so much more. That is the meat of these episodes.
And then plus in every episode, we'll also discuss a lore topic. They were called archives for our Empyrean coverage. They will be called something else for this one, of course. And it'll be to help you better understand the world building in the ACOTAR series.
Side note, everyone, Lexi is a master at doing these, and the level of research that she goes into them, it's absolutely amazing. I cannot wait for these with the ACOTAR universe. Now, some episodes will also include Maasverse highlights. What this means is at the very, 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 very end of the episode, we're going to give a huge spoiler warning that basically says, look, if you have not read the entire Maasverse, goodbye, please leave. But if you have, please stick around with us, because now we're going to go into how these chapters cross over in other aspects of the Maasverse. It will be quite literally the ultimate ACOTAR deep dive reading journey, and I'm just so excited.
And we're kicking it off on February 26th with A Court of Thorns and Roses, chapters 1 through 5. We have posted our full chapter-by-chapter breakdown schedule for the first book. So if you want to read along with us, go over to our social media, save that post, and we will see you in ACOTAR. Moving on, but still sorry we're not done talking about the crossover because now we are officially going into the Prythian caves. I can't stop saying it. I loved every moment in Prythian. I did not care what was going on for Ethan or Tharion and all of the messes that they were digging themselves into. All I wanted was every moment in Prythian with Az and Nesta. But I do think we got the right amount of crossover. Nicole talked a lot about that. I think it was the right amount. It was a CC book with ACOTAR guest appearances, and ACOTAR didn't overpower the book whatsoever. I really liked that. Would I have liked a little bit more crossover? Yeah, sure. But for what it was, I was satisfied.
Yeah. So in hindsight, me as well.
I admit I have always been a Cassian girl. I love my Cassian. I am a Cassian girl through and through. But after these Az chapters, I see it. I really do see it. And I recognize you now as girlies. Like, oh my goodness.
I'm so there with you. Like, but prior to this, I was like, okay, like I like Azriel, but he doesn't really do a lot. And I get it now. I loved getting more insight into his powers and seeing him in action and seeing him, you know, obviously like be the hard ass that he is, but also joke around a little. Like it was so cool seeing it, and it really helped prep us for ACOTAR 6, which we do know will be one of the main POVs will be Azriel. Now, a big question a lot of people had was why the hell Azriel couldn't just like winnow them through the caves, but he could power up Bryce. And the answer is I have no idea, because we do have confirmation that Az can winnow, but he just didn't.
I guess I just automatically assumed it was something to do with the magic in the caves. Like,
sure.
Like, you know, like how like in the Harry Potter caves, like you can't apparate to and from. And so I just kind of assumed it was something along those lines.
But Bryce winnows at one point.
I'm trying here.
I know, you did so good. I do think it was just a little bit of a plot hole. And to be honest, that's going to happen in a story as dense as this. So, oh well.
Yeah. The last thing I will say, and Nicole and I touched on this at the beginning of our Iron Flame deep dive, is the way that the next book in the series kind of recaps what previously happened. And I actually really like how Crescent City 3 did this, because it was Bryce explaining things to people who did not understand what was going on in her previous world. And as the readers, we needed that too. We needed it to be dumbed down to level 0, and us all walked through it. And I think that was extremely fitting. It was a perfect setting for us, for Bryce to have to explain everything with the Asturi, the whole info dump that we got at the end of CC2, explaining this to people who do not know what a battery is, who do not know what anything in her world is. And I really appreciated that. I think that was very much for us readers to understand what the heck was going on when the book opened. And that kind of continued throughout. You know, we even got some really great ACOTAR info dumps as well. Like, I don't know if info dumps. We got little info nuggets sprinkled throughout. And again, it was stated in a way that Bryce would be able to understand. So I love it when lore is dumbed down, so to speak, for the readers, for the characters. And I really appreciated that was done here. I wasn't really bothered by Bryce like you, Nicole, were in part 1.
Hold on. No, it was only the ending choices she made. I loved Bryce in part 1 up until letting the Asteri out, stealing his dagger, and then jumping through a hole back to Lunathian. Didn't love that, but everything up until that, I loved Bryce and Prythian.
I believe that we do agree as well about her hostility towards the ACOTAR characters that we know and love. And that hostility made sense.
Yeah.
Their whole dynamic together, Bryce, Az, and Nesta specifically is what I'm talking about. I understood where everyone was coming from. It was an interesting and bold choice for SJM to pit Bryce against some of our favorite people from ACOTAR. Bryce is tricking them and she puts them in danger. She acts a little high and mighty with them. And then she steals Az's beloved dagger. I saw in another reactions video, I'm so sorry, I can't remember which one it was, but she called it his emotional support dagger. Yes! And it made me cackle because it's so true. I understood why Bryce needed it, you know, to go like kill and save her world. But poor Az, he needs his emotional support dagger.
Here's my deal with that whole situation. I understand why she took it. She had to. She needed the Star Sword and the dagger to be together. I was more pissed off because of Azriel. And like, I was so sad for him and losing his emotional support dagger. Like, I saw someone else, I think it was a meme on TikTok, that was basically like, imagine Azriel going to Reese and Cassian and being like, my dagger got stolen.
It's not funny at all.
It's not funny. It's so sad.
Like, he probably wallowed for like a week afterward.
And it's funny because he's not in part 3, really, like when she opens up the portal again. And it's funny. I just imagine him like off in the corner, just like wallowing in self-pity about his dagger being gone. The reason I was so angry with her in regards to this, because I do feel the need to explain myself ever so slightly. I understand her stealing the dagger. It made sense. It was so sad to me as a reader who loves these ACOTAR characters so much. They were my introduction back into fantasy. They are going to hold a special place in my heart. I cannot separate that. That's just part of the human experience. But I was so emotionally distraught for Azriel here. And so I was very sad. I do understand, however, why she needed to take the dagger. I do not understand why she needed to let loose a fucking Asteri on Prithian. Don't get that. But everything else makes sense in terms of what her character was needing to do.
Of course, did we want Bryce to trust these characters more? Yes. But she was also, as Nicole said, in a different world and trying to accomplish her mission to get back to her home world where her loved ones were all in grave danger. Bryce acted like I would expect Bryce to act. Yeah. And I really liked her interactions with Az and especially Nesta. Especially when they agreed that they would be friends under different circumstances. Oh, my heart just swelled so much. Like, I just had so much love. More for Nesta than for Bryce, just because of how far she's come.
Yeah. And that also, I think, really beautifully set up at the very end because it was all over the whole like, oh, we would have been friends in a different world or whatever. It was all over Nesta's 8-pointed star. So I loved bringing that up then, and then having the full circle moment that we'll talk about later when we get to part 3, but having that moment to bring it back into play. It was just such a cool tie-in. I loved it.
And then we have the big info download, where we get a lot of lore information from the hologram Selene in the Prithian caves. As Nicole mentioned, one of our Discord members, Sealy Queen, she provided a quick recap that she gave us permission to share here. So I'm just going to go through it. Again, this is super high level, just so we can all be on the same page. So the Daglan, aka the Asteri, they ruled Prithian for 5,000 years. They created the Dread Trove, and the cauldron had been on Ramiel. Queen Thea wielded the Trove. Thea had Autumn Cart allies. That makes a little bit of sense there. Other shifter fays arrived on Midgard, which they are, remember, from the Tog world. They already knew Rigelus, the Asteri that we also know. They used the harp to transfer magic into her daughters' bodies. Selene and Helena, who were her daughters, they were the last ones to use the harp to lock the people out. And then Selene, she filled a prison to hide her magic, the harp, and the Asteri. And that is like the shortest possible version that we can give of this lore dump. If you want an in-depth summary on Selene and Queen Thea and the Daglan and all of that lore, please follow on Instagram, yaz.the.bookish on Instagram. She posted a fantastic lore summary of this. It's linked in our show notes, and I highly recommend checking it out for the full lore download and to follow her for more Maasverse guides.
This lore download had my heart pounding from the second Selene showed up. It was masterful. I am so excited as to what this information download means for specifically ACOTAR 6 now. I'm going to be fascinated as to how Sarah J. Maas is going to tie all of this download in. Like, is she going to take us through these caves through as in Nesta's perspective at the beginning of the book? Like, how are we going to get this information download as an ACOTAR reader? I'm going to be fascinated as to how all this works. Also, especially the fact that Selene looks just like Reese's sister, and that's just traipsed over and moved on to the next thing. I was like, can we go back to that, please? Can we please go back to that for a second? That was really shocking. I'm so excited as to how this set up both of our stories and where they go from here. I also loved seeing Bryce and Nesta react to the info download at the same time, and how they were like, bitch, and it's like cussing Selene out as she's just this hologram. It's funny.
To wrap this part up here, we already touched on it, so I won't go too far into it. But, so Nesta kills the Asteri that Bryce lets out. Bryce goes back to her world, but not without Az's emotional support dagger. I was really ready to see what Bryce would do with all of this information. She saw what she needed. She met who she needed. She learned what she needed to know in order to take the next step in her epic mission to take down the Asteri in her own world. When she took Truth Teller, it also felt like a promise that we'll reconnect with these characters later in the book, which I'm so glad that we did, at least with Nesta, because Bryce, she wouldn't just take it and not give it back, right? Like, she's bold enough to take it, but she's still the caring person who gives it back.
I thought she was for a while, and I was not alone. There were a lot of people in our Part 1 Discord channel who were feeling very similar, how they did not like how it left off in Prithian, and they were scared that was all the Prithian that there was going to be. Of course, we do get Prithian later, and by the way, that is Lexi did text me, oh, Nesta's back, oh my gosh, she's giving her parents up for collateral, what the heck? And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Well, okay, so we got to take it back a few more steps because I was only on chapter 36.
It's true.
Nicole and I share an Audible, and so when we're reading the same book, it will jump to whatever part the other one was reading to. And I knew that Nicole was further along than I was. So every single time I would bring my Audible up, I would immediately do like the go back to, and it would go back to where I was. And I don't know, like I was with the kids, I would life was crazy, and I turned it on, and I just thought that it was playing where I thought it was. And all of a sudden, like, all these things are happening where I'm like, wait a second, I don't remember this happening. I don't remember, like, that goes to show how little happens in part 2, where I skipped over. I eventually realized I read from chapter 70 to 77. I read 7 whole chapters before realizing that it was not the right space. It was not the right point. And so I'm texting Nicole once, and it's like, oh my God, Nesta's back and blah, blah. And Nicole is like, what are you talking about? And that's when I pulled it up, and I was like, oh my God, I am so sorry. I've just been listening to like the next 7 chapters for you, and I've just been telling you everything that's happened.
But that's why I was so okay with it, because I truly thought that was all the Prithian we were going to get, and I was pretty pissed about it. I'm not going to lie. Again, this was my first read through. I had a very different level of expectation. I was thinking it was going to be very Avengers Endgame, so I was dealing with some of that feeling, and it is what it is. But when you texted me that, I was so relieved, because I was like, thank God. Mainly because I wanted Azriel to get his emotional support dagger back. Like, that was a big part of it.
I just, like, that just goes to show, like, how little I knew what was going on. That, like, I just picked up on chapter 70 from chapter 36. And I was like, oh, yeah, like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's fine. Like, I'm sure I just missed it or something.
That is so funny.
Okay, so now we have Rune, Baxian, and Hunt in the dungeons. I'll admit, I was a little bit mad at Rune for a little while, and especially as they were like escaping the dungeons for stonewalling Lydia the way that he did. Is he freaked out that the girl he loves turned out to be the Hind? Yes, and he has a right to be upset about that. But come on, dude, she killed the Harpy. She was supposed to have killed the Harpy. I'm not even going to go down that road about people dying and not staying dead. She risked everything to break him out of the dungeon. And he's like still acting like she doesn't exist. And like he literally said, like, you are dead to me. Only when he thinks that he's lost her, like when she goes to sacrifice herself, is when he kind of comes around and he realizes what he lost.
And interesting. I felt like his anger / distaste for her was very on par. He has been hearing about this vicious Hind for years. He's been interacting with her for several months now. I think he met her for the first time in the last book when she showed up with the Harpy and started playing poker and like definitely freaked him and Ethan out at the bar. This kind of like shit the girl I had a crush on is someone I've been fearing for most of my life. It felt very in his nature. Also given the fact of his dad tortured him and beat him as a kid, and here's this woman who tortures and beats people for her job, and him being like, fuck, I fell in love with my dad. Like, I feel like there was a little bit of that. So Rune, prior to this, also never had deep feelings of love towards anyone, or at least that we saw. So the first time he opens his heart up, it's someone who is in this nature. I don't blame him for being like, fuck no, this is what I rebelled against my entire life. Like, he has tattoos and piercings and half-shaven head, all because he wanted to basically say fuck you to his dad. Yes, the tattoos are to also hide scars that his dad gave him. Yikes. And like, so I think that a lot of it was him realizing, oh my God, that's who I just fell in love with.
I can definitely see that. That does make a lot of sense now that you say that. I will say this. I am so relieved that he worked through it and they ended up with the sweetest love story here.
Yeah.
Not that it had much to contend with, but yes.
No.
I was listening when it was the scene where Baxian was biting off Rune's hand, and I was cooking dinner at the time. And I definitely had to pause the audiobook because that was so gross and not something I wanted to do with food around. But I also I really actually loved, in a really twisted way, this scene here because it shows just how desperate these poor guys were and how they didn't have anything left to lose. And did it ultimately matter in the grand scheme of things? Nope, not whatsoever. But I actually liked that because sometimes these moments don't matter in the big scheme of things. And I like that it was still there. I like that it was still their effort that was showing through. And they were just desperate. It really fuels how helpless their situation was.
I agree. I've said it once, I'll say it again. I love torture scenes in fantasy. What does this say about me? I don't know, but every moment that we weren't in Prythian, but we were on these pages, I was equally as happy. I cannot say the same thing for Ethan and Tharion's storylines. But when we were in these dungeons with our three gentlemen, when Hunt saw the shadows move in the corner, I thought it was Azrael. I thought it was Azrael's shadows because there is a bit of a time difference between where Bryce is in the timeline and where these boys are. These boys are a few days ahead of Bryce. And so I thought that, somehow, because their timeline was a few days ahead of Bryce's timeline, Bryce and Azrael went through the gate and they went to go help with the inner circle. My brain starts going down all these different places. So I was a little damn, it's just the Prince of Hell. But I still thought it was really interesting, especially when we get into Hunt's storyline later. It made so much sense that it was the Prince of Hell being hey, nice to see you. The moment where Rune says his joke about the Fae and two angels and, they walk into a dungeon and they all just break down laughing. It was so wholesome and just, I loved it so much. And it really, to your point about the hand eating, it really showed just how lost, how Lydia says it. She's oh my God, they are so close to breaking. Yeah. And that's terrifying. I also loved getting to see these moments through Lydia's point of view. I was horrified for her whenever her and Pollux were interacting. Pollux is a fucking monster. That was really hard to read, but I loved watching her put her rescue mission into action. It was so good.
I loved her character and how she was simultaneously desperate to get Rune and them out, and she was playing her cards right. You got a little glimpse into the Hind, into what she's been going through for however many years, and I really loved that we got that.
Let's talk about the side characters, because quite literally, even though they were the main POVs of this book, you can't call them anything but side characters for part one. I have listened to this book now twice through. I did this 10-hour outline on Saturday, and I still couldn't tell you jack shit that happened to Tharion and Ethan in part one. Mainly, I needed to go out, and by I needed to, I mean my husband was out, and I asked him to buy me a physical copy of this book so that I could jog my memory as to what the fuck happened to Ethan and Tharion in part one. They were in the fighting pits with the Viper Queen, and Ethan made the deal to get Tharion out. That's it.
The whole time that Ethan was talking to the Viper Queen and agreeing to this that she has up her sleeve, I'm just no. Just let Tharion be. Just let him be where he put himself. Let him just be a super drugged out guy. Why is anyone trying to rescue this guy? They're but he's our friend. It's are you really that close, though?
They did need him to get onto the depth charger in order to get Hunt, Rune, and Vaxian out of the Asteri dungeons. They needed somewhere for them to go. They needed to get to the depth charger.
That helps me a little bit, yes, because I didn't catch that.
I didn't until I literally had the physical copy in front of me. And Lexi, I spent 10 hours on this outline because I had no idea what was fucking happening for the first part of this book to these two characters. The only thing I liked about spending time with Ethan and Tharion was getting to hang out with Deck and Flynn, who are two of my favorite side characters. I really enjoy them. I will say the fight with Sigrid was cool. It was just distracting to me because of all the cutaways to the Prithian download. And it wasn't like a cutaway and then like we had multiple pages with Ethan. It was like a cutaway and like half of a page before we cut back. And it was just like, could we have just stayed with Bryce? Like, I just need to, I need to be immersed in that in order to know what's going on. And I don't feel like I got that, but I did like the fight with Sigrid, mainly because I was ready for her to die also.
I initially thought that Ethan was going to have to fight Tharion to the death or something like that, which I would have honestly maybe preferred. But I like how the events played out. Ultimately, Ethan's arc, of course, is a reluctant leader. We've already touched on that. And this is part of his journey. There was definitely shock value in the Viper Queen scenes. However, again, I wish we felt more invested in the involved characters. Tharion and Ethan, they made their self-loathing everyone else's problem. And everyone else was just sick of Tharion by his part 2 dumb decision. And it's just like, yes, thank you. Can we ditch him, please?
Speaking of part 2, let's dive into said part 2, starting with breaking out of the prison. This was fucking epic. I was on the edge of my seat this entire time. And Lydia, in her deer form, jumping off of the cliff, I seriously thought she was dying. I thought she was going to die.
I did too. I thought that she was dead. And I was so sad, but I was also weirdly satisfied as well. Because even though I love her character, it would have been a very poetic sacrifice that I would have been emotionally invested in, even if we hadn't gotten to know her as much as we wanted to. That would have been part of the emotional investment of it. It was like, that would have been a great opportunity, but I would have understood why she left us before it was her time. Well, I do have very strong feelings about characters dying and coming back so willy-nilly, especially in this book. I am ultimately glad that she did, because she is a fantastic character who we do get to know, of course, better throughout the book after this happens. And then, sweet Rune just crying like he was so broken in that dungeon. And when this is about the escape and the fact that like once when he got out and he's just like can't contain his emotions, it's just like, I just love you so much.
Well, and then Rune sitting by Lydia's bedside, and he didn't take any meds to help regrow his hand that vaccine just ate off, because he wanted every single one of those meds to go to Lydia and saving her. Like, oh my God, I love Rune. I love him so much. And then when he was speaking into Lydia's mind, she's like conked out, she's completely unconscious. And he's speaking into her mind and he's like, day. And then he finally says, Lydia. For the first time he says her name. Oh, I died.
I loved it. I loved it so much. I loved them so much. Aw.
Well, and then Lydia learning where she is. I thought that she was somewhere where, she as the hind would have been in danger or something like that.
That's what I thought too.
I was like, why is she running? Like, what? She needs to be okay. And so she like rips out all of her tubes and she starts bolting through the depth charger. And then it ends up where she's running to a year 9, I believe it's year 9 floor, where she looks in a window and sees her 2 sons. And it's just like, oh my God. Wow.
Yeah. Like, okay, let's pause here because, oh my God, everybody, Lydia has children. I don't think anybody had that on their bingo card. Yeah. Like I said, when we talk about our character, while it was a little bit jarring and out of the blue, I ended up liking this twist. It took me a little while to warm up to it, but I did ultimately like it. And that's because it adds so much more to her backstory, why she switched sides, and her motives, and why she's a dreamer that she's risking her life in the scariest ways day in and day out. Ultimately, it's because she wants to protect her kids. And I really liked her relationship with the boys, how they have another family, and she's their bio mom, and there's a lot of conflicting feelings there. And I really liked the complexities that came with that.
Every single meeting she had with her 2 kids, even though the dads are in the background or like one of the dads, like every single meeting was just perfect with them. I loved it. It. Something I loved and I didn't love, I'll call it, was we're going to rope these all in together, was the Bryce and Hunt reunion and the way that Bryce treats Hunt throughout part 2. Their reunion is in this meeting with the Ocean Queen, which, by the way, I loved meeting the Ocean Queen. She is fascinating. She's like this all-powerful being that enters the story, and I got scared of her. Like, I was like, oh, she's scary. But all of the descriptions around like her hair moving as if it's underwater, and despite her being totally dry, she's still left like wet footprints. It was just so good. And she put Tharion in his place, which might be why I love her so much. And then it left Bryce to make this, epic entrance. She says, quote, "You hand him over and you'll have a third queen pissed at you." And you'd think that it would be this epic reunion of Bryce and Hunt, and maybe not running into each other's arms, but some kind of reunion between the two of them. And nope. In fact, to quote Lexi, when I was like, okay, I'm covering, like I was talking about the outline, I was like, okay, I'm covering Bryce and Hunt's reunion. She texted back, "They reunited there."
It's like so lackluster. The way that they both thought about each other and desperately wanted to reunite back in part 1. Remember the way that Bryce saw his photo on her phone and gave her all the feels? And, they were just worried to even hope for the possibility of even ever seeing each other again. All throughout part 1, I was so excited for the reunion. And it was just so it fell so flat.
You can't help but compare it to, for example, like a Feyre Rhys reuniting in ACOTAR, where literally Feyre collapses on the ground and starts crying, and then he scoops her up into his arms, and he's like, "Everyone find somewhere else to be for a while," and they have a long, beautiful moment together. And this just literally Hunt looks at her, and it's like his soul leaves his body. He starts basically sobbing, but Bryce doesn't even look at him. Bryce doesn't even look his way. She is in full queen face-off mode. And I kept waiting for this big swell or this big moment, but it was just nope, meeting's over. And then she got to run to her mate, who was tortured for almost a week. And you were desperate to get back to, but that's fine. We finally got there. It just felt a little anticlimactic. However, like we do on this podcast always, we are going to put ourselves in Bryce's shoes here. And if I'm in I need this all-powerful queen to respect me and see me as a leader mode, I do understand why she showed up in this way in the room. Sarah J. Maas writes queens. There is a reason that all 3 of her worlds have very highly powerful women. Sometimes it needs to be all business. And when I look at it this way, it's easier to see it as a character choice if it weren't for the fact that he was fucking tortured for days and days. That's where I go a little bit where are your priorities, Bryce? That's, I think, where I get a little frustrated. She does have this moment with him after the Ocean Queen leaves, but then when Rune bursts through the door, Rune and Bryce, get to run into each other's arms and have this epic moment together. And it's her first time where her and Hunt are alone. They have a fight. It's weird. I understand it from a character choice standpoint. I don't understand it from a storytelling choice standpoint. That's where I get lost.
I 100% agree with you. It made me be like, oh, wait, these 2 are mates, right? It's yes, but we knew it was confirmed. Yes, they're mates, but it was weird. It was weird. And I was, as Nicole says, not satisfied.
Not satisfied.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they go to Avalon.
Your sign. But I actually really loved the Avalon part because it added new bad guy characters. It added a mysterious place. It added more lore. I really liked it. However, it did have some of my least favorite character interactions. I just love how Avalon becomes this beautiful and bountiful islands. I can just so envision it so perfectly. And I just love how Avalon just transformed after Bryce broke it free. Yes. It felt very Moana-esque.
Yes. I could not help but think of Moana, the woman on the island, everything about that. Absolutely. I also really liked Rune and Lydia's interactions here, where they're kind of learning how to trust each other. But to your point, the character interactions, specifically Bryce and Hunt, were where I had issues with Avalon. Bryce is, in her efforts, trying to get away from the Fae Kings, they're both in the Autumn King and Morven are in the caves with them, and they're trying to get away. She causes a cave-in with her laser-esque star powers, and everyone has to jump into the river to get away. And as everyone's running towards the river, Hunt starts wondering why his mate is making decisions without telling him, and he starts spiraling out of control, wondering if Bryce even trusts him anymore since their fight on the depth charger. And he's wondering why it's been so fucking weird with them ever since. And then once they get on shore, he turns to Bryce and he's like, "What the fuck was that? Why did you do this?" And then Bryce accuses him, a man who's been tortured for almost a week.
After he was tortured for years.
7 years ago. accuses him of letting his fear and guilt swallow him whole, that he's not doing enough, and that he doesn't even want to be here and help defeat the Asteri. I don't understand. I don't have words. There's a difference between being mad at a character but understanding their character choices. Like, we've all experienced this in literature. I am mad at Bryce and I do not understand these character choices. And that's, I think, what got a lot of us fans really raising a hand and being like, is this the Bryce we all know and love? Hunt has been actively traumatized and tortured for doing something that he was actively against in the fucking first place. And then after she goes off on him, he apologizes to her, which he didn't need to do. I'm sorry. He did not need to do. And he's like, I'll go along with your crazy ass plans. Just tell me. And she says, and I quote, "That's not good enough for me." I seriously thought they were going to break up. Nope. Instead, they're still married. They were married in the first place, which I don't even remember happening.
I'm quiet right now only because you were saying everything that we're all thinking. And I'm just nodding along. And just as Nicole would say, retweet. Like, it is just, yeah, exactly what you just said. I don't need to reiterate it. Like, we've already been harping on this so much, but it's just, it's because it is needed to be said a million different ways.
And again, like, Lexi, you and I normally are like, okay, how can we look at this from this character's point of view? I truly sat down to start writing that part of the outline, and I had to delete the 2 words, which were Bryce is, and then it was just blank because I couldn't think of anything.
Like, when I was saying about her character, when we were talking about in that section there, and you touched on this as well, is that she had to be in her element. She had to be focusing on the number one top priority. Number one top priority is defeat the Asteri. And so I get it from that perspective, but again, it felt very out of character in terms of why she is going after this mission in the first place. It is to protect her loved ones. And that's where it felt out of character for her.
And let's not forget that at the end of the day, these are like romantasy novels. These are romantasy, which means that romance is a huge part of this. And there was not a single moment between Hunt and Bryce after they reunited and were together that I felt even remotely like, oh, these 2 people love each other.
At the end, yes, but not anywhere before that. Yeah.
Which made the end fall flat to me, which is why it didn't feel believable at the end. You know what I mean?
We could just talk about this all day long, but let's keep going because, again, we did rate this 4 out of 5 stars.
We did. We promised we liked this book. We are harping a lot on the things we didn't like about it, but we will get to things we really liked about it. It's just mainly because we're in part 2 right now.
And then, of course, we have Tharion marries Flynn's sister, Sathia.
So after yeeting illegally off the depth charger against the Ocean Queen's will, like, there's a shudder through the ocean when Tharion hops on board. Tharion just keeps on making stupid decisions. And
then everybody is pissed off at him too, which I loved how people aren't even looking at him because they're pissed off at him. And it's like, okay, thank you. It's not just us. Like, people are pissed off at his decisions in the book as well.
So someone memed, you know, the Barbie movie, like when she's like, she's driving in the car, she's like, closer I am to find. Yeah. And then Ken emerges out of the backseat. It was like Barbie, you know, is everyone on their way to a Valen, and then Ken emerging is Tharion coming in.
Like I said, when we were talking about Tharion's character, I really do feel bad for Sathia and this wet blanket of a husband of hers. I'm sorry, I keep using that term, but it is just how I describe him. He is a sack of potatoes. He is a wet blanket. He is all of those things that just suck. But with that to say, that was a very decent thing that Tharion did. We got to give credit where credit is due. Stepping up to marry a female in need, especially coming from a place of being a protective older brother, this was the most depth and real sincerity that we've gotten from this character. It made me be like, okay, maybe you can redeem yourself to be an interesting character. And then the ending happens where he offers to divorce her and marry the River Queen's daughter, which he was trying to avoid in the first place. And that's what spurred all of these stupid decisions. But anyway, that's what I was just like, oh my God, Sathia, get away from here. Go be with your love. Like, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself to the ending here, but I just we're very passionate about this.
Well, my guess is that maybe Sathia and Tharion's quote unquote love story might be the main one of the main ones of the next book, him trying to get her back from her ex-boyfriend. Hopefully SJM figures out a way to make that high stakes. It's her. I'm sure she will.
I like the idea of them being able to be friends. Like maybe you know what? Maybe he will end up with the fire dragon and it'll be like that new Disney Pixar movie, Elemental Elements, where the fire and the water beings, they get together and they learn how to be in a relationship with their elemental differences. And it's really cute. And then and then maybe the dragon lady, she makes him stop being such a whiny little bitch. I'm sorry, I don't have very nice things to say about this character. And I keep talking about Disney movies because I have children.
I actually am so here for that idea. If him and Ari get together, I'm so here for that. That'll be like Batman and Robin, except for Ari is Batman and he is Robin, and it's like derpy Robin. That's all we can say on Tharion in part 2, honestly, because it's time to move on to Hunt's daddies. So we learn that Hunt was created by 2 of the princes of hell. And I'm just going to do a quick little info download just because this was a lot to learn in such a short amount of time. When Apollyon, the prince of the pit, said, "Hello, son," and that was the end of the chapter, I about screamed. We're surrounded then by Thanatos, who is the prince of the ravine, 4th level, Adis, prince of the chasm, the 5th level, and Apollyon, the prince of the pit, the 7th level. And we learned that Hunt was made by Thanatos and Apollyon, so the 4th and the 7th level, so that he could aid in the Starborn descendants. Basically because they thought that Thea, who split her power into 3 different places, would basically fail in her believability of any descendant of her being able to obtain all 3 of these powers. So they made a substitute power so that if the descendant did not succeed in getting all 3 of them, they at least had a backup battery. And the fact that he meaning Hunt, also happened to mate her, that was the unexpected twist that the princes of hell were like, well, that was emotion.
I love it because that means that fate really was at play here. I love that Hunt was made literally for Bryce. And that was so just fitting for his character. Again, being the supportive spouse of his headstrong partner. It fit. And again, I'm totally on board for that. I love how the fated mates play into this. I love how they are meant for each other in more ways than one. I love that he is her supporting person in more ways than one. I thought that was really beautiful.
I agree. So this download is slightly confusing, so I'm going to go through just the highlights that we learned from this other than Hunt's daddies. So we learn about something called ley lines, which basically means that there's this big universal grid of lines that these lines can intersect and overlap. Those are where the world veils are at their weakest, making it easy to have a rift in the world. For example, the Northern Rift in Nenya is where ley lines overlap. Immediately, I thought of Rifthold in our Tog universe, but that is a theory for another day. We also learn about that third part to Thea's power. I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail now. Thea's power was split into the sword and the knife of the prophecy, but we learned that Thea had a third type of the power, and we learned that this is where in Avalon, Bryce shoves the sword and the dagger into the ground. She unlocks Avalon. That is unlocking the third power. We learned that she can kill the Asteri through a black hole gate, but only if she has all 3 of these powers activated. And the princes wanted her to be able to use this power to open the Northern Rift and literally let all of hell break loose. But because the princes of hell had doubts that a person, a descendant of the Starborn Thea, would someday be able to come around and obtain all 3 of these powers, they made a fallback, enter Super Battery Charger Hunt. They also made the Thunderbirds, but that's honestly just a side note in this huge download. This here was Project Thur that Danica was investigating last book.
I'm so appreciative for everything you just said because that just made everything make a lot more sense.
Good. Yay.
Like I mentioned, I loved how this played out here. Yeah. Was it a huge central part of this bigger story? Maybe not, but it was a nice little nod to Hunt's origin story, especially because it solidified a lot of what the readership speculated. Now let's talk about the Autumn King and Morven's deaths. When the Autumn King had his research and sent all of his servants away back earlier in part 2, I was kind of hoping that he would end up playing a bigger role than we were led to believe, even a slightly positive sense. Maybe he wasn't as terrible of a person as we thought. Maybe he was ultimately on the same path as our characters were, but he was, going his own route, so to speak. I even texted Nicole being like, oh my gosh, maybe the Autumn King isn't so bad. But nope, he was just a straight up bad guy, which I'm okay with because the Autumn King does suck in more ways than one. The High Lord of Autumn sucks in ACOTAR, and he sucks here too. And it's like, all right, cool. I'm happy that we're consistently on theme with all of that. It felt so poetic that Rune got to be the one to kill his father. I'm glad that Bryce didn't take that from him. Again, I did not like a lot of things that she did, but it's kind of like she knew that was his kill, so to speak. And I appreciated that she was able to recognize that and kind of do an old Bryce thing there.
This was like satisfying beyond belief. For Rune to be able to tell his ass wipe of a father that he learned from the Oracle that the Fae royal line would die with him, and he got to tell it to him mind to mind right before he sliced his head off. God, it was delicious. It was so good. I loved it. I too was like, oh, maybe he's got like a bigger role to play. Like I thought, with him being like the Autumn King, there would be more of an in-our-face tie-in between him and the Autumn Court from Prythian, but no, there wasn't. And you know what? That's okay. I'm okay with that.
The only real tie-in that we got was that Thea had Autumn Court alliances. And so we can assume that when she traveled to Midgard, that some people, especially royals from the Autumn Court, they also went there. And that is how they really got established in Midgard. That's my understanding, at least, of it from the context that we received. We are finally on to part 3, the Ascent.
Oh my God, we made it. So let's start off with the antidote and the wolves section. At the House of Flame and Shadow, which is, by the way, it sounds like the coolest private club ever. Like, I would so probably be part of the House of Flame and Shadow. This place looks awesome. Hypaxia and Ethan find a cure. What's really Hypaxia? Ethan's just there for support.
He's there to be the bodyguard, right? Like, he really embraces that role.
Ditches her and goes over the wolves and like, oh my God, whatever. They look for the cure for this parasite. And really quickly, because we haven't really touched on this, the Asteri poisoned the water of Midgard so that everyone on the planet basically has a watered down version of their magic. And this is after the Prythian people, who had much greater magic, were able to rise up and kick them out of their planet. So this was basically the Asteri being like, mwahaha, we can, make them weaker than they actually are. But Hypaxia researches a cure and figures it out really fucking fast.
It's like, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. Now, Hypaxia, will be the first one to say that it's not perfect. It's only temporary. It's unstable. It needs to be tested. But Ethan's like, we don't have time for that, which, fair. But also, like I said earlier, I'm excited to see how perfecting it plays out in the next story and the consequences of this whole world now having a lot more magic than anybody ever even thought possible that was within themselves.
Well, and we discover that Ethan has ice magic. Hello, Tog Fae shifter line. I was freaking out during this part. That was so exciting. Ethan brings this cure now to the wolves to rise up against Sabine. And this is where I was like, okay, Ethan's storyline is starting to really come together. I get this. I thought the wolves were going to rally behind them, but no. Then he's like, we can have Sigrid, a Reaper, be our new head of wolves. I wanted to throw something at Ethan for being such an idiot.
Again, like, I'm putting myself in his shoes. More than anything, I feel like this was him deflecting the inevitable. That it would have to be him to go up against Sabine. And he was too scared and too blind to that possibility. Like, it's crazy that it never even dawned on him to dethrone Sabine. Even after the Prime tells him that it should be him. But he's just like, no, like, that can't possibly be me. Again, like, it's his way of deflecting it. It's his way of putting all of his eggs in one basket because he just doesn't want it to be his own basket. Yeah. But yeah, especially after she's a Reaper and it's like, Ethan, you are just riding this train right off the tracks. Like, he is holding on for dear life.
The other wolves were like, that's who you want? And it gets worse because Sabine kills her father, aka the Prime. Sigrid then goes feral Reaper hungry on his corpse, and that's when the wolves are like, Ethan. Ethan, dude. And then Ethan kills Sabine and ends up Prime himself. And did Ethan kill Sigrid? Who killed Sigrid? Or is Sigrid still alive?
No, Sigrid's still alive. She's a Reaper now, and she's out in the world after she killed the astronomer, and it's like, maybe that's something that is going to be a problem.
Yep. Probably. The last thing I want to note here is that Ethan's part 3 storyline really ties up with him going to talk to Connor and Connor giving him the first light bullet. I was just openly weeping at this part. It was so beautiful. He's such a, like, even as Prime, he is full Prime now. He's still this lost little sibling who has always had someone to look up to, like I mentioned earlier, whether it was Bryce or Rune or Connor. He's always had someone, and now it is him. He is the person who needs to look up to himself. And we just have that final moment with him and his brother basically saying, like, it's on you now, dude. Like, I'm gonna yeet out of here, but it's on you. And it was just so beautiful.
I loved how it felt very full circle, and he finally got that closure with Connor that he has desperately needed for so long. Remember, he's been trying to have this reunification with his brother since, gosh, the beginning of CC2. That was the whole reason he got mixed up with the astronomer in the first place. And so I really loved seeing that all play out in his storyline.
And I do feel like his storyline, at least in the grander scheme of CC, it's just getting started. Like, next book, I definitely want to see him, trying to put the wolves back together. Most of them, remember, they left basically with Amelie under the guise of like, oh, we're running from the Asteri, meh. But like, it was really running away from Ethan, who wanted a Reaper as Prime, but that's fine. It's going to be him gathering the wolves back together now with all of this elemental magic at play. Like, it's going to be really cool to see where Ethan and his story goes.
And I actually really liked this wrench of him becoming Prime with all the other wolves leaving, because if they had all just accepted him after that shit with the Reaper, it would have been a little too wrapped up nicely with a bow. There is going to be conflict as he tries, keyword, tries to lead the wolves, and he's going to have to lean way more into being a leader and envisioning a future to lead them towards. That's his biggest thing, is that he isn't able to see more than one step ahead. He does not see the bigger picture. He is not a very strategic person, and as this leader, he's going to have to start thinking that way. And so I hope that we start to see that more from him, where he then has to prove himself and really has to regain the trust of the wolves, but not just that, but actually help rally them towards something better. But he has to see what that is first.
And I imagine him and Perry are going to be really like working side by side. Like I mentioned, I do think it's going to be their love story, which she and Flynn were kind of like making eyes at each other. The last book, we'll see. But like, I'm excited for it to be like him and Perry and him. I really do hope it's a him and Perry situation, and that all the elemental magic and everything.
I think there's also a very intriguing question mark around Perry in general. If I remember correctly, she refused to take the antidote at the end and therefore gain full power. Why? Like, because a few other characters were hesitant to take it as well because they were just scared of tapping into their full potential. And I wonder if maybe that's the case for her too. I don't know. There's a few breadcrumbs that I'm very excited to follow with her.
And this is where I see a lot of the Tog crossover really get to shine in the CC world. So, I'm so excited.
Overall, Ethan's path to primehood, it was far from linear. And hitting rock bottom gives him more character development than half of the other people in this book. Again, like going back to Tharion, like he's also in rock bottom right now. And maybe the reason that I am more interested and root for Ethan more is because he has had his arc start to see its way up. We can see the light with him. And with Tharion, he is still just like... his wife just left him. Like, everybody leaves him, and it's like, or he leaves them, and it's like, I will stop talking about him as we continue moving on.
Well, let's talk about two people that we do like, but maybe not a choice that we like. We have to talk about Rune shooting Lydia, because I love my guy Rune. I love him so much, but oh my God, what a stupid decision. Lydia is coming out of an abusive relationship. He at one point starts making out with Lydia, and he like, in that like male dominance way, like puts her arms above her head, and she fucking flinches, and he's like, oh my God. Obviously. So shooting her in the leg is fine. She is also a terrified mom who wants to get to her children. And she's also the fucking hind. Like, let's not forget that. She can take care of her goddamn self, and Rune did not trust her to be able to do so. Did not love this. I did not love this.
I was like, Rune, you bad boy. And while I don't condone what he did by any means, this was actually one part of Lydia's character that I wasn't the biggest fan of. As you were just saying, she is the fucking hind. She is the hind, and she has always relied on a cool head to get her through extremely dangerous situations, and most likely some very emotional ones as well. And she is a scared mom in this sequence, which is a little off base for her. Again, it was a little bit jarring for her to suddenly be a mom. Not suddenly, but, for that to suddenly be part of her character. And I say this as a fellow mom who would be absolutely terrified and going crazy trying to find her babies in the Asteri's clutches. I'm not denying this line of thinking because I would be doing exactly what she is doing. Like, she goes unhinged trying to find her children, and she does get very sidetracked, as Rune notices there. But that's kind of my point here, is that while I would certainly act that way as a mom's terrified for her children, she was the Hind, and she's supposed to have her emotions checked in a way that I personally never could. Now, I think this decision for her to become all mama bear was part of her shedding her identity as the Hind. She is fully embracing her identity as Lydia, who cares about those she loves and will protect them at all costs. And from that perspective, I understand why she acted the way that she did. It was very much of a show don't tell way of her shedding her identity as the Hind and embracing her identity as Lydia, mom of these two boys. But yeah, Rune shot her. I didn't even touch on that.
And then Rune shot her. Good. I do love how Ace was like, you just shot our mom. Fuck you, dude. I do love that he put him in his place a little bit. So the Asteri death scene. I know a lot of people did not love this whole sequence here with the Asteri because they were like, oh, it was too easy. These godlike beings were just killed off too easily. Personally, I loved it. I loved how there was the Godslayer rifle coming back into play with Connor's first light bullet, and that is what opened up the black hole. There were so many full circle moments here. And sometimes people, again, those people who were like, well, it was too easy. Here's how I want you to think about it. When you're in a level 1 of a video game, your weapons, your armor, your skills, they're at the lowest that they're ever going to be. If you go and try to kill the main villain when you're at this level, you will die. It will be really fucking hard. It is an all-powerful being. But throughout the game, you level up. You finally unlock, maybe this store that gives you really powerful weapons and armor and level up potions and skills and all this kind of stuff. And then you go fight the main villain. It's going to be way fucking easier.
Tell me you play video games without telling me you play video games. I love that analogy so much. It is so helpful.
Listen, as someone who in an open world video game, Breath of the Wild, I went straight to fight Ganondorf and failed fucking miserably. I have seen this firsthand. Then I invested 1,000 hours and then I went to kill Ganondorf and it was really fucking easy. So that's all I'm going to say. With the rifle, the horn, Thea's power, the sword, the knife, everything else Bryce had, she had been leveled up like fucking crazy. Of course it was easier for her to kill the Asteri.
I also will say that I loved the fact that she did not have the antidote at this time. She never had time to receive it from Tharion because, he tried, but he didn't get it to her in time.
Shocking.
And then a bunch of them broke in the process. But, we'll skip over that part. She didn't need that extra level up. She had what she needed to defeat them, which was still absolutely plenty. But leveling up with the antidote to the parasite might have been almost too much.
The last thing I'll say on the Asteri front is I loved the moment where, Hunt sees Bryce through this portal and everyone goes to hold the portal open, including the Princes of Hell. It was very the teamwork makes the dream work moment. It was such a SJM climactic ending at its finest. This is what she does really well. And I thought it was just so beautiful that everyone came together hold the portal. It was very hold the door, but
I was just going to say hold the door. Oh God, I'm still traumatized from that.
I can't talk about that. It's so sad.
It might have been a little bit cheesy, but when all of Bryce's and Hunt's loved ones, like you were just saying, they're keeping the black hole open because in love, all things are possible. I think that Hunt even thought about that, when they were doing that. I just love how that central theme plays throughout this whole series. It really shows up at the most perfect moments, and I thought that was just a really great way for that to be represented there. Was it cheesy? Yes, but I don't care. That was one of those things where it's I don't care. I love it. Keep it in.
Yes, agreed.
Speaking of an SJM ending, let's talk about Bryce's death and her resurrection. I was more okay about this signature SJM main character death and resurrection than others. The Crescent City series really leans into the afterlife in ways that the other series don't. So the way Bryce's death, Jessica's sacrifice and replacement, and then Bryce coming back to life, I'm honestly okay with it in the context of our story. I wondered for a little while if she would actually die and stay dead, and honestly, I would not have minded if that was the case. No offense to our girl, it would have made sense within the storyline, partly because of the way that she was acting all book. It was not the same root for the FMC energy as it usually is. So maybe I was like, oh, maybe it's actually preparing us for a different outcome this time. No, didn't turn out to be the case. And while I absolutely agree that this is a copy and paste issue of SJM's, I'll reiterate, if it's going to work in one of her worlds, it would definitely be this one. Also, it would have worked well if she stayed dead, because this is the third book of Bryce's series. Unlike Farah, who died at the end of her first book of the series, it was like, okay, like, how is she going to come back? She obviously can't stay dead. Don't get me started on Reese's death. I'm not even going to go down there. We will discuss that when we do our ACOTAR deep dive.
I'm glad you mentioned this whole, if it was to work in any world, it would be this one. And I'm glad you bring that up, because it did kind of mellow out my really factor around this. Because personally, I've never been a big fan about the dying and coming back to life in any world, unless, and this is a huge unless, it has meaning and plot for the story. The only reason I was okay with Bryce's death is because we got to have that moment with her and Jessica. It was very like King's Cross, Dumbledore and Harry moment. And then, of course, with her waving to Danica and Lahaba. Like, that was fucking beautiful. I was crying. It was so emotional. We also got a little bit of an insight around like the Archesian amulet, with like learning that it belonged to the librarian priestesses of Parthos, and how like that's why Bryce has it. And just really quickly, this is like the mini download that we get. Remember that 15,000 years ago, hundreds and thousands of people marched to protect these books, this information, and Jessica was the one who ran away, and she made it her mission. And like we get all this like insight of Jessica and her, how much she wanted to protect Bryce, and how much she saw Bryce as the person who she would pass this knowledge and this 15,000 years worth of work down to. Also, side note, the Archesian amulet is the same design as the priestesses who we see in the ACOTAR world. We will cover that when we get to our ACOTAR coverage. But Jessica says this one quote that I just think is so beautiful. She says, "What is made of love can never be destroyed." And is this my favorite quote from the book? Highly possibly. The reason I'm cool with things like Feyre's death, it was there for a moment in the story. Feyre had to die as a human and be resurrected as a Fae, and there's so many poetic meanings behind it. It's not just she died and came back to life. It's that girl died under the mountain. She says it over and over in ACOMAF.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that I really enjoyed. If it was just Bryce dying and then coming back to life and we didn't get any of the moment with Jessica, I would have been like, are you fucking kidding me? Now, SJM also just doesn't kill off main characters. It's just something she just does not do. And I know that there are a lot of people who are frustrated because no one as a main character did die. And I do think that there are some books, you know, for instance, like the Empyrean series, who do make us very used to main characters or big characters being killed off regularly. But Sarah J. Maas has never been like that. And there was someone who said, and again, I'm so sorry, I can't remember their name, but someone said, look, like, we can't be mad at Sarah J. Maas for giving us a Sarah J. Maas ending. Like, we can't be mad at her for that. And I do agree. Yes, do I think that it's a little surprising that not a single character or side character except for Jessica died during this huge, big build-up war? Yeah, I am a little surprised, but also it's a Sarah J. Maas book. We can't be entirely surprised.
I will say I think it would have been a little bit more emotional with higher stakes if someone else had died as well. Yeah. Like, again, I thought for a second that Tharion was going to. He had a hole in his chest, but he was leveled up, so it was tougher to kill him. Missed opportunity, darn it. Again, like you said, I'm not surprised that no main characters died. I have the same gripe with ACOTAR, not to bring it up again, but like, again, I'm very happy that our main characters survived all of it. But again, it's, well, the same thing happened in Game of Thrones as it got to the later seasons too, which, like, who would have ever thought you'd say that about Game of Thrones? There was definitely some very heavy plot armor for characters. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Last thing before moving on to the Lord of the Rings length ending. It was like, remember how in Lord of the Rings, the third one, where it was like, oh my God, it was like literally like a 45-minute ending? That's kind of how it felt with this book too, where it's like, so okay, true. Like every chapter, it's like another ending, another wrap up. It's like, oh my God. Jeez.
It's so true.
The whole book happened in the span of something like 10 days at most, which is like, wow. That is an insane amount of things to happen in such a short amount of time. The Asteri are all powerful beings on the hunt to destroy our crew. Like, they are on the alert. They are, like, again, the boys broke out of their dungeons. They're not going to let that slide, and they're going to be on the lookout for them. They have over 1,000 mystics looking for them all as well. And our crew, they are racing the clock to get ahead of the Asteri before they wind up back in the dungeons, or worse. And I don't know if actually anything is worse than those dungeons, but anyway.
Not really.
Logistically, though, I have no idea how the whole book happens in such a short amount of time, just given the sequence of events. I will be super interested in reading or watching someone's guide on the timeline of events. Like, I'd love to see that to get a clear idea of how quick the timeline progresses. So if you have come across such a book timeline, please share it with us. We'll love to gobble it up and reshare the original creator's helpful guide, because I think we could all use something like this.
Well, and speaking of wrapping up this book, Bryce returning to Prythian, and we want to take a moment to just kind of talk about what this might mean for ACOTAR 6. Really quickly, just because we didn't cover it, I want to touch ever so slightly briefly on Bryce offering up her parents as collateral in exchange for the mask. So I understand why she did that. That feels very on par with Bryce's character. What I don't understand is why, after an entire fucking book of CC2 of Bryce trying to defend this kid who she did not know, Cooper/Emil, and she was the only one who gave a flying fuck about him, she did not also putting him in Prythian. My only explanation for this is that it was a tactical choice from SJM, because it would have been way too much for us to suddenly get this newish character in the mix of Prythian. Plus, if you've read Ember/Randall's bonus chapter, it would have been a very different scenario if they were also in protective parent mode. So I just wanted to address that right off the top.
Definitely. Well, and Cooper stayed on Avalon, and I believe that he was guarded by Fury, right? Like, yeah. Is that what happened? Yeah. And the reason that Bryce couldn't take him with her parents is because it would raise the alarm and it would not be as sneaky. I really do agree with you, though. I think that it was a very conscious decision to keep it easier for the reader and for us to digest it a little bit better. Bryce's plea with Nesta, oh my gosh, it pulled up my heartstrings in a way that she hadn't so far in this book. Like, the way that, like, Bryce was really showing emotion. I feel like it was one of the very first times that she really showed emotion, or the only times that she showed it in this whole book. And I needed this desperation before she faced the impossible. Again, like, we're kind of backtracking here to earlier on in part 3, because it raised the stakes a little bit more for me. I've been mentioning that I feel like for the book being as supposedly high stakes as it was supposed to be, it fell, again, like that 4 out of 5, it fell a little bit short of what I feel like it was supposed to make us readers feel. And a lot of readers are like, why the heck would Nesta just hand over the mask? I love that in the Ember and Randall bonus chapter, we did get that from Nesta. We understand why she agreed to hand over the mask, and it was quite shocking that she would do that, but once when she kind of explained herself a little bit, it's like, okay, I can absolutely understand that she was coming from a place of understanding the desperation and need to protect those that she loves, just the same way that Nesta does, from Bryce. And she really felt that camaraderie with her, and she knew how much it meant for Bryce to be handing over her parents because of the relationship that Bryce and Nesta had built earlier on in the book, talking about her parents and how much she loved them. So it made sense to me. Like, that was, out of all my gripes with the book, that was one that I was very easily able to move past, especially because of the bonus chapter that we got.
Well, and back to returning with these goods, with the mask, with the dagger, I was so relieved, again, because Asriel got his fucking comfort dagger back. I don't know why this was so bothering me for most of the book, but I'm very, very relieved. I loved every moment of getting to see Hunt interact with Cassian, getting to see Randall say goodbye to Cassian, and like all of them. And then, of course, Nesta and Ember's goodbye was just perfect. Ember says, quote, "You'll find your way." And that just like, oh, perfect. It was perfect.
You know, this may have won for the best moment of the whole book for me. Ember hugging Nesta. We've talked about it already throughout this podcast episode, but like, Nesta needed a mom hug more than anything, and this was the sweetest, most heartwarming thing ever. And this right here is why we needed the crossover, for Ember to give Nesta a mom hug. Nobody had that on their bingo card, but oh my god, I loved it so much. And another favorite moment was when Ember said that Rhys and Randall bonded over being overprotective dads. Oh, my heart, I can't take it. Rhys in daddy mode is just like, oh my god. And especially like seeing my husband become a dad, it just made me fall in love with him in a whole new way. And I need to see Rhys in daddy mode, because
Reese is my number one book boyfriend. Like, top of the charts. He swipes Zayden Ryerson out of the league. If I see Reese in daddy mode, I'm pretty sure my feralness for him will take whole new levels. Like, I'm so excited.
I'm like Cassian girl, and then like he's like 1A and then 1B is Reese. But oh my God, Reese in daddy mode, that's going to bump.
Can you imagine Cassian in daddy mode? Cassian in daddy mode's going to kill you. Kill you.
Oh my God. Like, I'm just going to leave this world and go straight there and just be like, yeah, I love you all, but bye.
Bye, Jake. But speaking of like the possibilities for Prythian, Bryce gives Nesta the Star Sword. This was not on my bingo card. This is all because of Nesta's connection to the 8-pointed star. And Bryce tells her that she thinks, quote, the 8-pointed star was tattooed on you for a reason. Take that sword and go figure out why. The chills that have shot up my body. I did not this is meant like many readers thought that Bryce was going to end up having some kind of future involvement with the recreation of the Dusk Court. However, now with Bryce's, like, the Starborn line ends with me, basically, we obviously know that is not the case. But Nesta, this opens up so many possibilities for what could come with the ACOTAR world.
It wraps Bryce's story up so beautifully, and it pushes the Maasverse back to Prythian and these ACOTAR characters. Which the fandom, oh my gosh, we're going to take this and we're going to run with it because that's what we do best.
Well, speaking of running with it, does this mean that Nesta is going to become High Lady of the Dusk Court and all 3 Archeron sisters are going to end up as a High Lady of a court? I think so.
I'd say that almost feels a little too cheesy, but this is SJM, and I think that it could be pulled off. I just can't wait to go back to this world in a few weeks. I'm so excited.
I can't wait.
I'm right now rereading Mist and Fury again. Like, I'm like 2.0 speed, like trying to get through it so fast, and they're at the prison right now, and I'm just like, I heard something about like how it used to be where the other court was, and I'm like getting all these hints now that we learned from CC3, and it's so much fun. I can't wait for our super spoilery section, the Maasverse madness. Oh my gosh, we're gonna have so much fun in it.
Oh my God, I can't wait. Oh my God, I'm so excited. All in all, I do think that part 3 was a beautiful way of wrapping up our story and setting up the next book for people like Tharion and for Ethan. And especially, it's a beautiful tying of the bow of Bryce's storyline, especially when she's giving this decree about the hierarchy of Fae basically being no more. She uses her father's favorite pen when she writes it. LOL.
I love that. See, like, that is the lovely little Bryce touch, like that sassiness that we love about our girl.
And this is so small, but I have to call this out. Someone in the crowd, as she's giving this decree, sneers like traitor. And Bryce thinks she could have sworn that same noble sneered at her at a restaurant years ago. If you remember, in the opening of CC1, she's out to dinner with that asshole guy who's like on his phone the entire time, and a woman did sneer at her at this restaurant. It's the same woman, it's the same callback. I love these moments in books that are so book-ended. It's so hot, pun intended. It's so beautiful. And then, of course, we also get the ending of The First Light and how that is slowly dwindling out. And I think that this is going to be a huge part of CC4. Specifically, how do they get the Ocean Queen's tech from the Depth Charger to all of Lunathian? Like, oh my God, I'm so excited.
I absolutely agree that this will be huge in CC4. But wait, we can't forget about the most important part of this whole stinking book, because the Pegasuses are alive! I'm so excited. They're on Avalon, and like Paxian is just like calling like, oh my God, guys, you gotta come here. It's an emergency because Jelly Jubilee is in the flesh, and oh my... I'm a horse girl. I literally have a horse tattoo. I grew up with horses. I am absolutely freaking out.
It was such a perfect moment. I loved it.
I was just so glad that they're alive and they're on the beautiful island and just all is well. All is well.
All is well.
And that's the book, friends.
House of Flame and Shadow, 3 hours later. But we're not done.
We saved our commentary on the bonus chapters for the end of the episode in case you haven't read them yet and you'd like to jump off. And if you're wondering about these bonus chapters, here's how it worked. Different stores had different bonus chapters available. Yes, it is super annoying. And the internet has been rising up together and figuring out how to give access to everybody. So there are certain content creators who have like Instagram stories highlighted where they took pictures of all of them and then uploaded them. Also, our CC3 bonus chapter Discord form, that has everything that you would need to proceed to this next part here. So anyway, this is your spoiler warning that we are going to talk about the bonus chapters one by one in 3, 2, 1. All right, so we're going to talk about bonus chapter number 1. It was Bryce and Danica. This was an indie exclusive, and it takes place before House of Earth and Blood, so it can be read before House of Flame and Shadow, or anytime really.
The second I saw that this was a flashback, I was like, oh my God, we're going to get the tattoo story. Fucking finally. I'm so excited.
I loved it, yes.
I love getting to see how much our girl Bryce has grown up. Like, she comes into her apartment and just immediately starts smoking a bunch of myrrh through. And also, Danica was not a good influence on Bryce.
Oh, no, not at all.
And I'm not going to lie, this passage reminded me of my early 20s times a million. But that is all I will say. There is a mention of the blackout last week that is being overheard on the news. So we learn right away that this is about a week after Danica stole the horn from the museum. I love that Bryce takes her bra off and she's like, the bra is off. It's the end of the day. And boy, oh boy, is that not the fucking truth. I don't know if you had the same experience, Lex. It was slightly hard to read given how much we know Danica is not telling her. However, that being said, I loved getting to see like the weird look on Danica's face. Like the way I read it is that she knew that she was not going to be around much longer. Danica had a hunch that she is on the outs and she needed a night with her friend. Obviously, I think she was planning the horn as well, so she wanted to get Bryce's fucking shit wrecked as she could. But it was cool seeing it through the lens of all that we know about Danica now.
Yes, I absolutely agree, because once when we have the context, I'll say, of everything that happens in the Crescent City series, and then going back and rereading those first few chapters of CC1 where we do know her, it's nice, but it still feels one-sided because we're only seeing it from what Bryce is recognizing in those moments. So that there aren't a lot of Easter eggs in that, but in this one in particular, we really are able to see it from a different lens. And I loved being able to see this because Danica is another polarizing character in this series. Because yes, while she was a great friend to Bryce, was she really though? Like, that's the big question. Is she kept so much from her best friend. She kept her mate from her best friend. And yeah, Danica would be able to explain why for all of this, but the fact still remains that she did it.
GFDD, God fucking damn it, Danica.
Yes. And I have very mixed feelings about her. I think ultimately I like her more than I dislike her. And so I really liked being able to see this perspective of her, and for all of us as readers to get this Danica experience that Bryce has been holding on to for so long.
When they're at the bar, both Danica and Bryce, there's like just a few little moments where they're like, ugh, angels are not my type.
I know.
And at this point, we know that Danica has mated Vaxian, and it was just like, lol, that was funny. There's also an angel from the 33rd that's making sex eyes as Bryce. She's making sex eyes back at him. Is that Hunt?
I don't believe so, because in CC1, when Hunt is like seeing her, like, he's so judgy of her. He's a total alpha hole about it. And I don't think that would have been him.
That's kind of what I was thinking. And then Danica is about to share about Vaxian, and someone interrupts her. And I'm like, this interruption in literature is going to be the death of me. I fucking swear.
Friends, if you don't listen to our Iron Flame deep dives, people interrupt people a lot in Iron Flame. And Nicole,
not people, Violet. Violet interrupts people all the time and drives me crazy.
And Nicole has a lot of feelings about it.
I do. Last thing, we get the tattoo scene, and getting to read how the horn powder dissolved into the ink and how Danica, she's almost crying. Like, it was awesome. I don't really have a whole lot to comment on it because I just really loved seeing this moment on the page.
I did as well. Was it my favorite bonus chapter? No, just because there were such incredible other ones, but this gave me the closure I needed with Danica. That's how I'll say it.
Speaking of bonus chapters that really stole our heart, we need to talk about Bryce, Nesta, and Azriel, which was the Walmart exclusive, and it can be read after chapter 16 of House of Flame and Shadow.
This was my favorite chapter of the entire book. This might have actually been one of my favorite scenes in all of the universe. Like, I loved it so much. It was so simple and yet so satisfying. Oh my gosh.
Like, hearing them explain the two different parts of their worlds, seeing Nesta getting, like, to see an iPhone with Spotify on it. It was just, oh my God. I love this idea because Nesta's like, the inner court's been trying to figure this thing out. And it's like, I wish we had that bonus chapter too. Like, can you imagine Cassian, Rhysand, and Feyre trying to figure out an iPhone? like
I loved, like, because we got that in the actual book, like, just like a little nod to it. And I was like, oh my gosh, where is that chapter? And then I read the bonus chapter here and I was like, okay, I will take this. Like, this is still fantastic. But oh my gosh. Okay, I just have to note though here. Poor Cassian, because in Silver Flames, he got Nesta the coolest, most thoughtful symphonia, a musical gift. And it was a really big deal. And, like, you know, because he had to work so hard on making sure to get, like, the right music on it. And, like, it was such a big deal. And then Bryce just whips out her phone with thousands of songs at her fingertips. And it just makes Cassian's gift that was so thoughtful, so wonderful, so magical, just be like, womp womp.
It's like someone having LimeWire. Isn't that what it was called way back when they download so many different things and then, like, showing up with, like, a 2024 Spotify, like, just
navigating all the viruses. Oh my gosh, those were the good old days.
And then we also get Bryce and Nesta really becoming friends. Like, this was just so beautiful.
I know. We saw hints of this in the book, but this bonus chapter is where we really see their friendship. And I'm going to call it a friendship here. They might not officially call it a friendship, but we will call it a friendship, especially knowing how difficult it is for Nesta to open up like this. We see what their friendship could have been, and it just makes me fall in love with Nesta and appreciate her journey all over again.
I will say my favorite part of this was Asriel and getting to see an insight that we don't normally see. All of the, like, do you have a mate, Asriel? I started screaming because this is just, like, perfect setup for ACOTAR 6. Plus Nesta answering for all of the fandom when Bryce is like, aren't you curious? Speaking to Asriel. And Nesta's like, yes, we are. We all are curious. But then Asriel he asks, what kind of music do they play in the pleasure halls? Side note, SJM has mentioned that Asriel is a freak in the sheets. Like, homeboy is kinky. And we're already getting a peek into that side of him. I fucking can't wait for ACOTAR 6.
It's like, yeah, like Bryce being like, oh, are you a club rat? Like, oh my God, it just had me dying. I loved it so much.
I also loved seeing Nesta and Asriel make up from the fight that they had, really seeing the family that they've become, especially they both now live, they both live at the House of Wind. It's just, I love it. Now, we also get Asriel humming and his shadows dancing after Bryce's phone dies. And this is a Court of Silver Flames bonus chapter spoiler. So skip ahead 2 minutes if you don't want to hear this. In the bonus chapter for A Court of Silver Flames with Asriel, we get a moment where him and Gwyn are together in the training ring. And Gwyn asks if he sings. And he reluctantly is like, yeah, I guess. And we get to see that here. We get to see him humming. And it's just like, oh.
A lot of readers have also speculated that this callback to Gwyn is more supporting evidence that she is his mate. But I'm not opening up that can of worms on this episode. I'm just calling out what I've seen on the interwebs.
I will just say one more Gwen thing, because we're not opening up the can of worms, even though I'm dying to do so. In that same bonus chapter in A Court of Silver Flames, as Asriel is leaving Gwen, his shadows start dancing. And we see that again here. And it's just, oh God, perfection. It's perfection. It's beautiful. I love it.
Oh, you want to know what else is perfection and beautiful?
The Ember and Randall bonus chapter. Now, the Asriel, Nesta, and Bryce scene is probably one of my favorites. This is equally one of my favorites in the entire book.
Oh my God,
it's so good.
Me too. So the Ember and Randall bonus chapter, it is available through Books A Million. It's their exclusive, and it should be read after chapter 80.
Now, I'm not going to lie. When I saw that Ember and Randall were going to get a bonus chapter, I was like, really? Like, why? And I'll just say that I was not anticipating to get my book from Books A Million. But the joke is on me because this ended up being one of my favorite chapters in the entire book. Rhysand interrogating Ember and Randall. It was a little hard to read because you see how angry he gets with Nesta. But honestly, putting myself in his shoes, I get it. He puts it perfectly. Quote, because they will kill her and take the mask and horn and open up a fucking gate to this world. Of course he's terrified for his people. Of course his son. Like, it makes sense why he's mad.
And I really did love seeing the side of Rhys because he is the High Lord, and we're not seeing it from Farrah's POV, who she, of course, views him with rose-colored glasses. That's one of the reasons why I really like seeing his character from a different perspective in Silver Flames, even though it wasn't as likable, but that's kind of the point. And it's also really great to see him in his element here. He is a scary shadow daddy for a reason.
Also, as he's interrogating Ember and Randall, there's a mention of his mouth twitching upward, like smiling, when they're talking about stubborn and reckless Bryce as a 1-year-old. And it's just a glimpse of Rhys' dad. I love it. I love it.
You all, oh my gosh, I'm going to go feral. I am feral for Daddy Rhys.
So excited.
I'm not a fan of the pregnancy trope. I think it worked really well for what it was in Silver Flames with a subplot B, C, D. But oh my God, Daddy Rhys is just amazing. Oh my God.
And then the next morning, Ember Quinlan putting Rhysand, the most cunning High Lord, into his fucking place. And of course, Azriel and Cassian are just sitting back enjoying every second of it. This was the World Collide crossover that a lot of us were expecting, and it was just delicious. It was delicious. I loved every second of it.
I know. And there goes Ember just stealing the show with another one of my favorite moments in the whole entire book, with how she just lays into him because she is sticking up for Nesta. Girl power. She is a mom who recognizes a daughter who has some serious issues. God, I just love her so much.
Yeah. I will say the only moment where I was like, oh, is when Nesta was like, Cassian is the most angry with me out of all of them. And it's just like, oh, I can't even imagine that. I can't even imagine Cassian being like that. But the best part of all of this was Nesta and Ember. It perfectly set up the hug in chapter 100, and it just puddle. I was a puddle. One puddle. That's it.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right. Now moving on in our bonus chapters here, we have Bryce and Hunt, which was the Barnes & Noble exclusive, and it's something that should be read after you finish House of Flame and Shadow.
I don't have a whole lot to say on this. It takes place the winter solstice after the end of our tale. We get some insight into how things have changed on the planet, mainly how sparingly First Light is being used. Phones are only allowed to be charged to 1/4 power. There's no TV, very little light, etc. This was also just really wholesome getting to see Bryce and Hunt joking around about such mundane things. It really brought back their dynamic of CC1 and CC2. And then really the only last thing I have on this is that when Bryce was giving Hunt the little baby, the little lettuce baby Hunt, I swear to God, my hand on this book, I thought that she was about to tell him that she was pregnant. I was like, oh, that's a bonus chapter, I guess. But of course that did not happen. This bonus chapter can just be described as nice. It was just nice.
I needed this after that book. We've talked at length about Bryce and Hunt and how they did not live up to our expectations, specifically Bryce staying in her character and being who we have come to love. And I'm still scarred from how they were in part 2, but this was a very needed, nice epilogue for them that really reminded me of why I love them and what made me fall in love with them in the first place. Last but definitely not least is Rune and Lydia's bonus chapter. It was the Target exclusive, and again, it is one that should be read after you finish House of Flame and Shadow. I loved this one so much as well. Oh my gosh, maybe it wasn't in Prithian like the other two ones that I absolutely loved, but this one was just, my heart just burst a million times in the best way.
I was truly speechless after this one. It's Rune and Lydia getting married, and it couldn't have been more perfect. This is about a month after the Asteri battle, and they're picking out furniture for their apartment, which is just so fucking relatable after you move into somewhere for the
and
first
they're
time.
learning about each other because it's they don't realize what their tastes are because they're just now being able to be a normal couple, and they've never been able to have these kind of mundane conversations before, and I just love it.
Well, and then we also learned that there's some theorists who think that the First Light and it running out is a conspiracy theory. Again, this is another thing prepping us for CC4. I thought that was a really cool little nugget that she included in this. But then, oh God, Lydia asks Rune to marry him, and they get married right then and there. It was just so perfect. I love that Lydia, who is, Lydia, she's fun, she's impulsive, she's great, because we're gonna do this right now. It's just it was just beautiful. It was just a beautiful scene.
I loved it so much. Now, I am not usually one for surprise weddings, I've actually attended at a surprise wedding, and anyway, I don't want to talk about it because they're definitely not together anymore. But this was not that case, and it is absolutely lovely. And how he's just like so excited to be a family. It's like, yeah, of course he's got Bryce. He's even got like her kids kind of, but it's like he and her as a family. It's just like, it makes him cry. He is the most weepy boy, and I love it so, so, so much. It just fits him so well, and yeah.
Oh my God, we did it.
We did it. That's it, folks.
That's it. You're welcome. That's what I have to say about it.
If you are still with us right now, first of all, thank you so much for being part of this. I hope that this helped you process the book a little bit, help you understand some other perspectives that you might not have thought of before. I also hope that maybe you can relate to some of our feelings and maybe you thought differently, which is fantastic if you did. That's the best part about this book and every book is that everybody has different perspectives. And we really do hope that you join us for our ACOTAR deep dive that starts on February 26th. If you liked this, then trust us, you will love what we have coming for you for the rest of this year.
As always, thank you to our executive producer, Hayden, aka our sanity manager. We love ya.
And if you want more Fantasy Fangirls content, you can join our Patreon. That is so much fun. Like we were saying at the top of the episode there, we have so much, especially as we gear up for ACOTAR. And of course, if you aren't already, what are you doing? Give us a follow at Fantasy Fangirls Pod on TikTok and Instagram.
Also, do not forget to rate and review the show or hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. It's so helpful with getting more people to find the show. And last but not least, share this with your fellow Crescent City friends. If you are also emotionally destroyed like the rest of your friends from Crescent City, whether that's for good, bad, or medium reasons, this is the perfect episode to send to them.
Yes, indeed. Thank you again so much. We love you. We will talk to you soon.
Bye.